Hey there. If you're new, welcome to the channel. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Let me know in the comments. Now, sit back, relax, and let the stories begin. A while ago, an acquaintance of mine who had once been a cop shared this strange experience he had a few years back. At the time, he was still a new deputy just starting out in patrol. Because of his inexperience, he was often assigned simpler tasks, ones that helped ease the load for the more seasoned officers. One night, he got a call over his radio to sit on a suicide scene. The victim was still inside the house, and they needed him to stand guard at the main entrance until the coroner arrived to take the body. The idea was to keep any relatives or outsiders from entering and disturbing the scene or tampering with evidence. It was pretty standard protocol. The deputy arrived at the home, confirmed with the officers already there that his job was just to wait for the coroner, and then settled down on the front porch. It was the middle of the night, so he took out his flip phone and started playing a game of Snake to pass the time. The area was eerily quiet, with everyone else gone. The only sounds the deputy could hear were the occasional barking of distant dogs and the soft hum of traffic on the highway. The silence, especially considering what was just a few feet away inside the house, was unsettling. His instincts were on edge, so he kept his ears tuned in. That's when he thought he heard a rustling sound coming from inside the house. He sat still and listened carefully, but after a few minutes of nothing, he convinced himself it was just the house settling or something. Over half an hour passed, and he started to feel drowsy staring at the tiny screen of his flip phone. He closed it up for a minute, leaned back, and tried to relax. But then, the rustling sound came again, this time louder. It was like the sound of papers being shuffled, or so he thought. He listened again, and there it was again, unmistakable. This time, he was sure it came from inside the house, where the victim had been. His nerves were starting to get to him. He didn't want to call for backup just yet, but he didn't want to go inside the dark, creepy crime scene by himself either. After a few moments of indecision, he stood up, resting his hand on his sidearm, ready for anything. That's when a loud noise from behind him made him spin around toward the front door. The window next to the door was covered by vertical blinds, and as he turned, a sudden movement disturbed them. The deputy told me he definitely jumped and screamed, just like anyone would in that situation. When his heart stopped racing, he focused on the face staring back at him through the window. The deputy's eyes went wide, and the person on the other side of the window looked just as startled. The two of them stared at each other for a moment, both realizing how foolish they must have looked. It was the victim's cat, which had most likely been taken in by a relative after the incident. The deputy told me that it was one of the scariest moments he had ever experienced in his entire career. There are certain things that stick with you, no matter how much time passes. The kind of experiences that burrow themselves deep in your mind, waiting to resurface when you least expect it. For me, it was the year I spent in college, living in an apartment with a guy no one else seemed to remember. At first, I thought I was imagining things, that maybe I was just overthinking it. But the longer I stayed there, the more I realized something was wrong. It was my sophomore year when I moved off campus into a small, two-bedroom apartment. The place wasn't anything special. Cheap rent, worn carpets, and a view of the parking lot. But it was a step up from the dorms, and I was glad to have my own space. When I signed the lease, I was told I'd have a roommate named David, who had already been living there for a year. That didn't bother me. I'd always gotten along with my roommates before, so I didn't expect any issues. The first few weeks were uneventful. David kept to himself most of the time, rarely leaving his room except for the occasional trip to the kitchen or bathroom. We exchanged polite greetings, but there wasn't much conversation. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Some people are just quiet, I figured. He was probably busy with school or something. But then, things started to feel off. It began with small things. I'd come home from class to find David's door slightly open, even though I was sure I hadn't seen him leave. Or I'd hear odd sounds at night, soft footsteps, faint whispers, coming from his room, even when I thought he wasn't home. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just hearing things. Maybe the apartment had thin walls, and the sounds were coming from the neighbors. One night, I came home late after studying at the library. The apartment was dark, and David's door was closed, just like usual. I figured he was asleep, so I quietly made my way to my room, not wanting to disturb him. But as I passed his door, I noticed something strange. There was light coming from underneath it, but it wasn't the usual glow of a lamp or an overhead light. It was faint, almost like the light from a screen, flickering. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether or not to knock. But something stopped me. The apartment was eerily silent. The only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stood there a moment longer before deciding to leave it alone. Whatever David was doing in there, it wasn't my business, and I didn't want to be nosy. The next morning, I woke up early for class and noticed something odd. David's door was wide open, but his room was completely empty. The bed was made, the desk was clear, and there were no signs that anyone had been in there recently. I stood in the doorway for a moment, confused. Had he left early? Maybe he had a class or something. But as I glanced around the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that day, I ran into a mutual friend, Sarah, at the campus coffee shop. We got to chatting and I mentioned David, asking if she knew him. She gave me a blank look. David? Who's that? I frowned. My roommate. He's been living with me for a few months now. Sarah shook her head, laughing. I thought you lived alone. I stared at her, completely baffled. No, I definitely have a roommate. His name's David. You've probably just never met him. He keeps to himself a lot. But Sarah didn't seem convinced. I've never heard you mention him before, and you've always said it's just you in that apartment. The conversation left me unsettled. How could Sarah not know about David? We'd been friends for years, and I'd definitely mentioned him in passing before. Hadn't I? Over the next few weeks, things only got stranger. David's presence became more and more inconsistent. Some days I'd come home, and it was like he wasn't even there. No sounds from his room, no dishes left in the sink. Other days, I'd catch fleeting glimpses of him as he moved around the apartment, but he never stayed long enough for a conversation. It was like he was slipping in and out of existence. One night after a long day of classes and work, I sat down to dinner with some friends. The topic of roommates came up and I mentioned David again. Wait, one of my friends said, setting her fork down. You've been living with someone this whole time. I thought you had a single apartment. I looked around the table, confused. Yeah, David. I've told you guys about him before, but they all shook their heads. You've never mentioned a David, another friend said, furrowing her brow. Are you sure you're not mixing things up? A cold chill ran down my spine. How could they not remember? I was certain I'd talked about David before, at least in passing. But the more they insisted, the more I began to doubt myself. Had I really been living with someone, or had I just imagined the whole thing? That night, I went home, my mind racing. I stood outside David's door, staring at it, wondering if I should knock. I needed to talk to him to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But something about the silence coming from the other side of the door made me hesitate. I turned the knob slowly, pushing the door open. The room was empty, completely empty. There were no clothes in the closet, no books on the desk, no signs that anyone had ever lived there. The bed was stripped bare, and the walls were blank, like a room that had been uninhabited for months. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. How could this be possible? David had been living with me. He'd been here. I'd seen him. We talked, shared the same space. I wasn't imagining it. Couldn't be. But as I looked around the room, a horrible thought began to creep into my mind. What if David had never existed? I backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment felt different now. Colder. More empty. I locked myself in my bedroom, trying to shake off the heavy feeling of dread that had settled in. I kept telling myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe David had moved out while I was at class. Maybe he was just messing with me, playing some kind of prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The next day, I went to the apartment office to ask about David, hoping they could shed some light on what was happening. When I asked about my roommate, the woman behind the desk looked at me strangely. "David?" she repeated, flipping through her files. "There's no one by that name listed on your lease. You've been living here alone since you moved in." I stood there, stunned, my heart dropping into my stomach. "That's not possible," I said. "He's been here the whole time." She shook her head. "I'm sorry, but there's no record of anyone else living in your apartment." I left the office in a daze, my mind racing. How could this be happening? How could I have lived with someone for months, only for him to vanish without a trace? No one else remembered him. There was no proof he'd ever been there. To this day, I still don't know what happened. Maybe David was real, and he simply disappeared without anyone noticing. Maybe he was just some kind of figment of my imagination, a creation of my mind. Or maybe there was something darker at play, something I'll never fully understand. But one thing is for sure, I've never felt truly alone in that apartment since. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of footsteps, the soft creak of a door opening and closing, like someone is still there, like David is still there watching, waiting, and I don't think he's ever really left. For the past few years, I've been juggling 2 jobs, usually leaving my house around 6 a.m. and not getting home until 10 p.m. I'd then sleep, and the cycle would repeat the next day. Unfortunately, that's just been my routine for a while, but something happened just a couple of months ago. One night, I came home and did what I usually do, shower and get ready for bed. While I was in the shower, though, I heard some movement that sounded like it was right outside the bathroom door. I quickly got out, checked, and saw nothing, so I figured it was just the house creaking or something. I finished up and went to bed. Throughout the night, I kept hearing strange noises around the house, mostly creaking, like if it were windy and the house was swaying. But there was no wind, and no reason for the house to be making these sounds. At one point, I even got up in the middle of the night and walked around, trying to figure out what it was, but I couldn't find anything. The next morning, I was extremely tired, running on coffee to get me through the day. When I got home that evening, I was hoping for a good night's rest. I went straight upstairs and turned the shower on. But before I even got in, I heard something outside the bathroom door again. This time, I was certain it was right outside, and it sounded like it passed by and left the bedroom. It almost seemed like something had moved across my room. Though it was unlikely, it genuinely sounded like someone or something had been in my room. I knew I had to check, but I felt uneasy. Eventually, I worked up the courage to look, but there was nothing there. I walked through the house, quickly checking each room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. Maybe inside the walls or under the floorboards. I showered and got into bed, falling asleep just before midnight. When I woke up, I instantly knew something was wrong. It was still very dark, and the house was silent. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but I could feel it was connected to the sounds I had been hearing. I peered over at the door and saw the slightest movement of a shadow from under the crack. I jolted up and stared across the room. My heart immediately started racing as I saw the shadow move away from the door and heard them begin walking down the upstairs hallway. I was horrified and frozen in fear, but it must have been the surge of adrenaline that got me out of my bed and made me swing open the door. I looked out, and standing at the end of the hallway was the dark outline of a man. His eyes were the only thing that really stood out to me. They pierced through me with a sense of anger and restlessness. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it. The man's footsteps immediately went down the stairs, but it took another 30 seconds before I heard him leave the house. I got the police to come as soon as possible, but they didn't have much luck. They found a few signs of the man being in my house for at least a few days, but that was about it. I don't know where he was hiding, but I always think back to when I'd hear him walk past the bathroom door. Maybe he was sleeping in my bed, then quickly would hide in the closet until I got in the shower, where he would take the opportunity to leave the room. I also wonder why he spent that extra time downstairs before leaving the house, when he knew I'd seen him and had likely called the police. Everything is just speculation at this point, but knowing that some random man was hiding in my house while I was sleeping is a horrifying thing to think about. As far as I know, the man hasn't come back and there have been no updates on his identity. The flickering neon sign of the Stardust Motel should have been my first warning. But after 12 hours on the road, all I wanted was a bed and a hot shower. I had no idea that checking into room 13 would mark the start of the longest night of my life. My name's Alex, and I'm a traveling salesman. Cheap motels and endless stretches of highway are like a second home to me. I've seen my fair share of rundown rooms and shady characters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night at the Stardust. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot around 11 p.m. The motel was one of those old-school, single-story places you see scattered across rural America, paint peeling, rust stains on the walls. But when you're in the middle of nowhere, beggars can't be choosers. The office was dim, lit only by the glow of an old TV. Behind the counter sat a man who looked as worn and tired as the motel itself. His heavy eyes locked on me as I walked in. "Need a room?" I asked, stifling a yawn. He grunted, reaching for a key without taking his gaze off me. "25 cash," he muttered. "Checkouts at 11. I handed over the money, and he slid the key across the counter. "Room 13. Great. Anywhere around here to grab a bite?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Kitchen's closed. Vending machines busted. Nearest place is 30 miles down the road." Of course it was. I sighed, resigning myself to the granola bar and lukewarm water bottle in my car. As I turned to leave, the old man spoke again. "Word of advice, stranger," he said, his voice low. "Lock your door. Don't open it for nobody." I paused, a chill running down my spine despite the stuffy warmth of the office. "Why's that?" I asked. He just stared at me for a moment before turning back to his TV. Conversation over. Outside, the night seemed even darker than before. The few streetlights in the parking lot cast sickly yellow pools on the cracked asphalt. I hurried to my room, suddenly desperate to be behind a locked door. Room 13 was exactly what I expected. Faded wallpaper, a sagging bed, and a bathroom that had definitely seen better days. But it was a place to rest my head, and that's all I needed. I took a quick shower, the water never quite getting hot enough, then settled into bed with my laptop. Might as well get some work done before turning in. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud thump against my door. I sat up, heart racing, as another thump came, followed by the sound of scratching. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the dark room. No response, just more scratching. I reached for my phone, ready to call the front desk, when I remembered the old man's warning. "Don't open the door for nobody." The scratching stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. Then, a voice low and gravelly, "Let me in. Please, I need help." Every instinct screamed at me to stay put. But what if someone really was in trouble? I slid out of bed, approaching the door cautiously. "Who's there?" I asked, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "Please." The voice came again, more urgent this time. "They're after me. I need to hide." Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man stood there, his face hidden in shadow. But what caught my attention was the dark stain spreading across his shirt. Blood. "Jesus." I breathed. "What happened to you?" He stumbled forward, pushing against the door. "Let me in. Quick." I hesitated for a split second, then made a decision I'd soon regret. I closed the door, unlatched the chain, and opened it fully. The man practically fell into the room. As he passed under the light, I got my first good look at him. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with wild eyes and a day's worth of stubble. The blood on his shirt was real. "All right, thank you," he gasped, leaning against the wall. "They almost had me." "Whose kind they?" I asked, closing and locking the door. "What's going on? Should I call an ambulance?" He shook his head violently. "No, no police, no ambulance. They'll find me." I was about to press further when another knock came at the door. This one was different. 3 sharp raps in quick succession. The man's eyes widened in terror. "Don't answer it," he hissed. "Whatever you do, don't let them in." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I approached the door slowly, trying to peer through the peephole, but it was too dark outside to see anything. "Management," came a voice from the other side. "We need to speak with you, sir." I looked back at the bleeding man, who was shaking his head frantically. Against my better judgment, I called out, "Everything's fine. I'm trying to sleep." A pause. "Then, sir, we have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive. Open the door now or we'll be forced to enter." "Fugitive." I turned to the man, who was now backing away towards the bathroom. "What the hell have you gotten me into?" I demanded. Before he could answer, there was a loud crash as the door burst open. 3 men rushed in, dressed in dark clothes that could have passed for uniforms in the dim light. But the guns in their hands were very real. On the ground, one of them shouted, "Both of you now." I dropped to my knees, hands raised. The bleeding man made a dash for the bathroom, but one of the intruders caught him, slamming him against the wall. "Please," I stammered. "I don't know what's going on. He just asked for help." "Shut up," snapped the one who seemed to be in charge. He turned to his companions. "Search the room. Find it." As they tore the place apart, I stayed on the ground, my mind racing. What were they looking for? Who were these people? After a few minutes of fruitless searching, the leader grabbed the bleeding man by the collar. "Where is it?" he snarled. "I don't have it." The man gasped. "I swear I don't." The leader backhanded him across the face. "Don't lie to me. We tracked you here. Now where's the package?" "Package?" My eyes darted to my laptop bag. Oh God, what if one of the other men noticed my look? He grabbed the bag, dumping its contents onto the bed. Among my papers and cables tumbled out a small wrapped parcel I'd never seen before. The leader's eyes lit up. Well, looks like our friend here made a delivery after all." The bleeding man sagged in defeat. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "I had no choice." The leader pocketed the package, then turned to me. "As for you, I'm afraid you've seen too much." My blood ran cold. "Wait, please," I begged. "I don't know anything. I won't say a word, I swear." He seemed to consider for a moment, then nodded to one of his men. "Bring them both. We'll let the boss decide what to do with them." As they zip-tied my hands and dragged me to my feet, my mind was reeling. How had a simple night at a motel turned into this nightmare? They marched us out to the parking lot where a van with blacked-out windows was waiting. As they shoved us inside, I caught a glimpse of the motel office. The old man stood in the doorway, watching impassively. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something there. Regret. Pity. Then the van door slammed shut, and we were plunged into darkness. The drive seemed to last forever. I lost all sense of direction as we wound through back roads, the van suspension groaning with every bump and turn. Beside me, the bleeding man was silent. His breathing labored. Finally, we came to a stop. The door opened and we were roughly pulled out. We were in some kind of warehouse, dimly lit and filled with stacks of crates. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, impeccably dressed in radiating authority. The leader approached her, handing over the package. "Well done," she said, her voice cool and composed. "And these are our loose ends?" The leader nodded. "The courier and an unfortunate bystander. What do you want done with them?" She studied us for a moment. Her gaze was clinical and detached. The courier knew the risks. As for the other, her eyes locked onto mine. "It's a shame you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, Mr. Alex," she said, her voice cold and deliberate. "Mr. Alex," she continued, her tone almost disinterested. "You see, we can't afford any witnesses. Our operation is far too important." My mind raced, grasping for anything that might save me. "Wait!" I blurted out. I have skills. I'm a salesman, I stammered, desperate. I'm good with people, with logistics. I could be useful. She raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. Is that so? And you'd be willing to work for us, knowing what we're capable of? She asked, her eyes narrowing as she waited for my answer. I nodded frantically. Yes, anything. Just please, don't kill me. She considered my words for a long moment before offering a smile. It wasn't kind. Very well, Mr. Alex. Welcome to the organization. I do hope you're as skilled as you claim, for your sake. As they led me deeper into the warehouse, my relief at being alive was quickly overshadowed by the grim reality of what I'd just agreed to. I'd escaped death only to step into a world I knew nothing about. A world of secrets, danger, and moral compromise. The bleeding man wasn't so lucky. The last thing I heard as the door shut behind me was the sharp crack of a single gunshot. That night at the Stardust Motel had changed everything. My old life was gone, replaced by something darker, far more dangerous. As I was shown to my new quarters, a sparse room in the back of the warehouse, I couldn't help but think of the old man's warning. Don't open the door for nobody. If only I'd listened. When people say nothing good happens past midnight, they're usually right. It was summer, and my girlfriend at the time, my best friend, and I snuck out like we often did. We did this a lot, and each time felt a little more adventurous than the last. Honestly, the first time we did it, the bar was set so low that it was easy to top. It was around 1:30 a.m., and the three of us were downtown. Our town had weddings that went on late into the night, and we spotted a couple stumbling down the street, dressed for a wedding. We started cracking jokes, acting like the typical dumb teens we were, when, out of nowhere, I saw the man hit the woman. I'm not sure if they were married or just dating, but for simplicity, let's say they were husband and wife. I looked at my girlfriend and my best friend and could see the shock on their faces. The man was shouting at her, saw us watching, and immediately ran off. Without thinking, and against my girlfriend's wishes, I rushed over to the woman who was lying on the ground, crying. My girlfriend and friends stayed back down the street, and I asked them to give me some space. I'm trained to handle situations like this. I'm in a Navy program and know how to talk to people. The woman was extremely intoxicated and barely able to speak, but I managed to calm her down a bit. I asked for her name, where she was from, where she was staying, basic things. We talked for about 15 minutes, and by the time my friends had caught up, they were giving me space like I'd asked. She eventually told me where she was staying, but said she didn't know how to get there and that she was from out of town. I reassured her that everything would be okay. I helped her to her feet, and we began walking to her place, which was about a quarter of a mile away. When someone's having trouble walking, 20 feet feels like forever, so the trip felt much longer. Still, I felt like helping her was the right thing to do. Luckily, the police station was right across the street. Thank God for that. I'm usually pretty cautious when we're out at night because there are some strange people where I live, and that night I was glad I was paying attention. When I turned around, I saw a man, tall, muscular, and looking furious, coming toward us. I asked the woman if that was her husband, and she started trembling, barely able to whisper, "Yes." I told my friend to get away from us because I knew things were going to get bad. They went to the other side of the street, and I could tell that they were scared for me. My buddy has his phone out ready to call 911, and my girlfriend was shaking. Then this guy was on me and his wife. He was screaming at me for having the audacity to help her and for being near his wife. The entire time, I wasn't occasionally glancing down in his hands when they weren't in my face to make sure they weren't in fists. I never said anything to try to start more of an argument. Only things like, "Sir, you need to step away from me. You need to calm down. The police station is just literally across the street." Things that you would say to avoid getting beaten up. I'm a tall guy. I'm 62 and feel like I'm not someone people want to mess with, but I'm under 18. This guy was probably early 30s, about 64, and honestly a 100% muscle. Very, very scary man. I looked down, saw his hands in a fist, and stepped back quickly, keeping his wife behind me. This wasn't smart. Standing in between a drunken man and his wife is a big, big no-no. I mouthed to my friends to get the police right now, and he turned around and sped the other way. The man didn't notice me doing this, so I figured I was good. The police answered my buddy, and he was pointing over to us, but they didn't come out. Took them about 5 minutes to come out, and by then, thankfully, the guy fled. I told them what had happened, and they sent out a search team for this guy. Turns out he was hiding on the road. We were just on a little down the way. The police took the woman, escorted her back to where she was staying, and kept the man in the station for the night. They thanked me for what I did and told my friends and me that we should go home. We agreed as youth does and went on our way. Moral of the story is, if you see someone who needs help, help them. It's up to you. Be the hero they need. The moment his hand closed around my wrist, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. His smile, once friendly, now seemed predatory, and the pulsing lights of the festival faded into a sickening blur. As he led me away from the crowds, I realized with growing horror that my search for my friends had led me straight into a trap. It was supposed to be the best weekend of the summer. The Starlight Music Festival was legendary, 3 days of non-stop music, art, and celebration. My best friends and I had been planning this trip for months, saving every spare dollar and coordinating our outfits with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. The first day was everything we'd hoped for. We danced until our feet ached, sang along to our favorite bands until our voices grew hoarse, and reveled in the electric atmosphere that only a music festival can create. As night fell, the festival grounds transformed into a wonderland of neon lights and pulsating rhythms. It was during a set by our favorite DJ that it happened. One moment I was dancing between Sarah and Mike, our arms linked as we swayed to the beat. The next, I turned around to find them gone, swallowed up by the surging crowd. At first, I wasn't worried. We'd gotten separated before and always managed to find each other again. But as one song bled into another and there was still no sign of them, anxiety began to gnaw at my stomach. I pushed my way out of the crowd, scanning faces in the dim light. The festival grounds seemed to stretch endlessly. A maze of stages, food vendors, and art installations. The press of bodies was overwhelming, the noise deafening. For the first time since we'd arrived, I felt small and incredibly alone. That's when he appeared. Tall, with a kind face and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He seemed like a lifeline in the chaos. "You look lost," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the music. "Everything okay?" I hesitated for a moment. Years of stranger danger warnings flashed through my mind, but he looked so normal, so concerned, and I was desperate for help. "I can't find my friends," I shouted back. "We got separated during the last set." He nodded sympathetically. "That happens a lot here." "I'm a volunteer," he added, pointing to a badge I hadn't noticed before. "I can help you find the lost and found tent. They might have gone there to look for you." Relief washed over me. Of course, the lost and found tent. Why hadn't I thought of that? "That would be great," I said. "Thank you so much." He smiled again, and this time I noticed how white his teeth were. How perfect. "No problem at all. It's this way. Follow me." I fell into step beside him as he led me away from the main stage area. The crowds began to thin out, the music fading to a distant thrum. I noticed we were heading towards the outskirts of the festival grounds, where the lighting was sparse and the revelry seemed far away. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, unease creeping back into my voice. "Shortcut," he said breezily. "It's just past these tents here." That's when he grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into my skin. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. "Let go of me," I demanded, fear making my voice shrill. His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it now. "Now why would I do that? We're just getting to the fun part." I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that was swallowed up by the distant music and laughter. No one could hear me. No one was coming to help. He started dragging me towards a cluster of dark tents. His free hand clamped over my mouth. I fought with everything I had, kicking and clawing. But it was like fighting against a statue. He was too strong, too prepared. Just as we reached the tents, a voice rang out. "Hey, what's going on over there?" My attacker froze, his head whipping around to locate the source of the voice. It was all the distraction I needed. I bit down hard on the hand covering my mouth, tasting blood. He yelped in pain and his grip loosened just enough for me to wrench free. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my heart pounding in my ears, my lungs burning. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the packed earth, his curses growing fainter as I pulled ahead. I burst back into the main festival area. The sudden press of bodies, both a relief and a new kind of terror. What if he was still behind me? What if he caught up to me in this crowd? Blind panic drove me forward. I pushed through the throng of dancers, ignoring their annoyed shouts and glares. I had to find security, had to find my friends, had to get away. I don't know how long I ran or how far. The festival had become a nightmare fun house. Every smiling face a potential threat, every shadowy corner hiding unseen dangers. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself near the medical tent. A concerned-looking woman in a Red Cross vest approached me. "Are you all right, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." The story poured out of me in a rush, my words tumbling over each other in their haste to escape. The woman's face grew grave as she listened, and she quickly ushered me into the tent. What followed was a blur of police statements, medical checkups, and tearful reunions. Sarah and Mike had indeed gone to the lost and found tent, frantic with worry when they couldn't find me. The festival security launched a manhunt for my attacker, but in the chaos and darkness, he had vanished. They found others, though. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that I wasn't the only one who had been targeted. There were other stories, other close calls. My attacker had been part of a larger operation, preying on the lost and vulnerable in the festival crowd. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze. I couldn't bring myself to enjoy the music or the atmosphere, jumping at every sudden movement, every unexpected touch. The magic of the festival had been irreparably tarnished. In the months that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and crowded places became a source of anxiety rather than excitement. I couldn't shake the feeling that danger lurked around every corner, that the next friendly face might hide sinister intentions. Therapy helped, as did the unwavering support of my friends and family. Slowly, I began to reclaim my life, to find joy in the things I once loved. But I never forgot the lesson I learned that night at the Starlight Music Festival. Now, when I go to concerts or festivals, I'm always aware of my surroundings. I keep my friends close, never wander off alone, and trust my instincts when something feels off, because I know firsthand how quickly a dream can turn into a nightmare, how easily predators can hide behind a mask of kindness. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear his voice in my head. I see his too perfect smile, feel the iron grip on my wrist. But then I remind myself that I survived. I got away, and in doing so, I helped expose a dangerous operation, potentially saving others from a similar fate. The Starlight Music Festival continues each year, but I've never gone back. The memories are too raw, too painful, but I hope that my story serves as a warning to others, to stay vigilant, to look out for one another, and to remember that even in the brightest of celebrations, darkness can lurk just out of sight. Because the truth is, the most dangerous predators aren't always hiding in the shadows. Sometimes, they're right there in plain sight, offering a helping hand and a friendly smile. And it's up to us to recognize the danger before it's too late. Every summer, for as long as I can remember, my family would gather at White Lake State Park in Tamworth, New Hampshire, for 2 weeks of camping in July and August. Some of my best childhood memories come from those summers: rollerblading, Nerf gun wars, flashlight tag, and water balloon fights with my cousins and the kids from neighboring campsites. It was always an unforgettable time. When I was in my late teens, though, Our family stopped gathering for these camping trips after my grandmother passed away. One of the last summers we camped there, something happened that has stayed with me ever since. I was 16, a little over 10 years ago. It was around 10 p.m. one night when I realized I had missed a call on my cheap little track phone. My family was sitting around the campfire, roasting s'mores and laughing, so I decided to step away for some privacy to return the call. I took a narrow trail that wound through other campsites, leading up to the bathroom. My plan was to find an empty campsite and sit at a picnic table to make the call. This side of the campground was mostly vacant, so finding an empty spot wasn't a problem. It was dark, and I noticed there weren't any other campers nearby. I chose a campsite and sat down at the table. The lights from the distant bathroom, located up the hill behind me, gave off just enough light to help me see my surroundings. I called my friend and started chatting. About 20 minutes in, while I was talking, I looked up and noticed a silhouette walking down the road in front of me. The figure was headed toward the empty campsites in my area. It didn't seem out of the ordinary, as people sometimes take a night stroll through the campground. What struck me as odd, though, was that this person wasn't carrying a flashlight, which most campers usually do when walking around at night. At that point, I wasn't really scared, just curious. As the figure got closer, I could make out a better shape. It was a man, and I noticed his pace seemed to slow down. I kept my focus on him as I continued my conversation, and after a minute or two, he suddenly stopped moving. He was just standing there in the road, staring straight at the campsite where I was sitting. I wasn't sure if he realized I could see him, but it felt like we were locked in some strange staring contest. He was tall, a bit heavyset, and I could tell he was wearing a light jacket. I couldn't see much in the way of facial features, but I would guess that I was staring at a man in his 30s or 40s maybe. Alarm bells were going off in my head now, and my mind had turned to mush at this point. I was frozen, and I was no longer listening to what my friend was saying on the phone. I was in a stare-off with this guy, and then he started to move again. But this time he was tiptoeing towards me really carefully, like he didn't want to make any noise. He put one foot in front of the other, leaned forward in a slight hunch form, and it looked like he was about to charge towards me or something. In that moment, I snapped out of that mind-mushy frozen state and leaped off the picnic table and started running through the campsite back towards the trail. I could actually hear him trampling behind me, the leaves scuffling in heavy yet fast footsteps, and the footsteps were getting louder and closer. I made it back to the narrow trail, and once he got close, I heard the sound of twigs snapping and the oof noise that came from the man, which I imagine maybe he tripped or almost tripped, or maybe he got face slapped by a tree branch or something. Most likely, he wasn't familiar with the trail like I was, but whatever the reason, it caused him to stop chasing after me. I didn't stop to look back, and I just kept running and running and running until I made it back to my family's campsite. When I got back, they were still sharing laughs and smiles by the campfire, and I broke down crying and was trembling. I explained what had just happened, and my aunt spoke up and said that he probably thought that he knew you and was coming up to give you a good scare as a joke or something. She just totally dismissed me, in other words. My cousin chimed in and said, yeah, he probably stopped running after you and realized that he didn't actually know you. He probably feels dumb now, and they all chuckle about it and change the subject. I think I was dismissed because no one wanted the good vibes of the night to be ruined, and the fact that I'm just a socially anxious person in general kind of let them dismiss me, I guess. I'm very cautious and shy, and for that time being, I let them convince me that I was just overreacting and overthinking, but here I am years later looking back and just shaking my head over this. I do wish that I was taken seriously, but other than that one thing happening, it was still a good trip. My experience makes me think twice about going for a walk by myself anywhere these days, and I carry pepper spray and a mini keychain alarm on me now. Anyway, I don't know what this guy was up to, but it sure was fishy given that he was alone in a campsite with nobody else there and was obviously trying to sneak up on me. I'm just glad that I can run pretty quickly. I'd like to start by saying that all the names in this story have been changed. Last year, in 2021, I was living in a townhouse in New Mexico with my twin sister, Carrie, and our two childhood best friends, Robbie and Izzy. The time in that house was full of the typical ups and downs of young adult life. but they were amplified by the turmoil of the pandemic. The house had its fair share of good, bad, and ugly moments, but I wouldn't trade those memories for anything. However, the last few months before I left the state were absolutely terrible. Let me give you a bit of backstory. Carrie had been in a relationship with a man we'll call Jay. Their relationship was very unhealthy, and it ended with him being kicked out of our house after an altercation between him and Carrie. The police were called, and we thought that was the end of it. But let's just say Jay didn't take being kicked out and dumped too well. One day, on the off chance I had a day off from work, I spent most of the day in the kitchen doing some deep cleaning and self-care. While I had no trouble with the first part, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I've struggled with anxiety due to PTSD, so I tried to write it off as just a bad day. That was until Robbie came home, throwing the door open and shouting, "Tell me why I saw Jay circling our block." I was in shock. I rushed to the window, looked out over our street, and sure enough, Jay's car was speeding off. We told Carrie about it as soon as she got home from work that day, and she revealed to Robbie, Izzy, and me that Jay had been stalking her. I wasn't surprised, given the details she shared. She then told us about something else that shook me to my core. About 2 weeks before Jay started circling the block, Carrie had been out with friends. She must have forgotten to lock the door when she came home. She woke up from a deep sleep, and she was certain that she saw someone standing over her bed. At first, she didn't want to tell us because she assumed she was either dreaming or having an episode of sleep paralysis. But later, she received a message from Jay, scolding her for not talking to him when he came to the house the night before. That night, when Carrie came home, I started locking the doors even when everyone was home. He had been in the house while we were all asleep, unaware that someone we didn't want anywhere near us was just lurking in the corner of my sister's bedroom, watching her. He could have done anything, but he just chose to watch her. That was deeply unsettling for all of us. At this point, I had already decided that once my lease was up, I would be moving to a different state to live with my partner. We were all packing up our things, preparing to go our separate ways. For more context, the landlord had installed a security system. Nothing high-tech by any means, but anytime a door or window was open, the alarm would say in a robotic monotone voice, "Side door open" or "back office window closed." Things like that. One night I was home alone. Carrie was at dinner with Robbie and Robbie's mom, and I had no idea where Izzy was until this series of events happened. I was in my bedroom when suddenly I heard what sounded like tapping on my window. I figured it was the branches tapping like they usually did when there was even a small gust of wind, but the tapping was constant, timed almost. I still shrugged it off again, trying not to make myself anxious while I was alone in the house. It was then that I heard the security system go off, back sliding door open from the other room. Weird. We all usually come in through this side door when the kitchen and living room meet, as our front door was next to impossible to open from the outside. I brushed it off thinking maybe Carrie and Robbie had forgotten their keys and just came in through the back door. I called out from my bedroom, "Carrie? Robbie? How was dinner?" No response. As soon as the words left my mouth, the silence was deafening. I walked out to the hallways where all of the bedrooms led and called out again. "Carrie? Robbie? Izzy?" Again, nothing. I'm getting a bit freaked out now, but I'm thinking that they maybe didn't hear me. With that silence, I will never in my life forget the silence that rang through that house as I inched closer to the living room. As I am finally standing in the living room, the only sounds I had heard in the span of a few minutes was my own heart beating out of my chest, my footsteps, and the AC kicking on. I finally reached the living room and I had checked Find My Friends. To my horror, Carrie and Robbie were still at the restaurant with Robbie's mom. Izzy's phone had broken during this time too, so I had no clue where she was still. Knowing what I know at that moment, I called out one last time, but I couldn't bring myself to turn the corner and go into the kitchen. "Izzy, are you home?" Silence again. I figured maybe I was just hearing things at that point. Then I heard it. Came a hushed whisper from the kitchen, followed by the most hurried footsteps behind me going out the back door. I froze. Who was that? It all made sense at that point. The tapping on the window, the door opening with no noise from whoever opened it. And now this. I knew at that moment that I was not alone. Something came over me and I snapped out of this frozen reaction. "You better get out of my house." I screamed at the top of my lungs. I grabbed the baseball bat that I kept in the hall closet and started shouting that same sentence in 10 different ways, opening all the doors and switching on all the lights, making sure that whoever this was had left. I finally made it to the kitchen and found out the sliding glass door was left wide open by whoever came into it. As soon as the adrenaline had worn off, the shock then set in. I booked it out of the house, locking the doors before throwing open my car door and ripping out the driveway without putting on my seatbelt. I called all my roommates whose phones still worked. I later found out that Izzy had actually left town for the weekend and I had missed that conversation. So I know whoever was in the house was not my sister or either of my other 2 roommates. Robbie called the police as soon as we got off the phone. Of course, there wasn't much they could do because nothing was stolen and I didn't see who was in my home uninvited. I drove to my coworker's house and I broke down telling her what happened, and I waited for her to update me on what she and Carrie were going to do. They opted to stay at the hotel with Robbie's mom that night. I don't know who it was that broke into my house that night. Was it Jay? Some drunk college kid who stumbled into our yard thinking it was their place? Someone with more sinister intentions who got caught at the right time? I am not sure. I think that is what keeps me up sometimes when I think too deeply about that night. I know it wasn't an anxiety-induced thing. I saw the door and I heard the whisper at the footsteps hurrying out the same door they came in. I am just happy that I live with my partner in a different state now, in a relatively safe neighborhood. But even that, some nights, is not enough to allow me to feel safe when I am home alone. This story took place years ago when I was around 6, 7, or maybe 8. My mom and dad had gone to visit family for a reunion, I think. It was held at a beachside park with a playground nearby. We spent the day swimming and having a barbecue, but as the day was winding down, my parents were chatting with some other adults, and I got bored. So I went to the playground to pass the time. I didn't think to tell my parents because, well, I was a dumb kid at that age. I figured they must have seen me, so everything was fine, right? While I was playing, a couple approached the playground. They were both Caucasian. The woman had wavy red hair with some blemishes, and she wore a faded overcoat and boots. The man was much taller than her, with a bald head and dressed in a blue tracksuit. They looked like middle-aged parents, probably in their late 40s or so. I didn't think much of them until they walked up to me. They waved at me and said hello, so I waved back. I stayed on the playset and didn't come down. But then they asked, "Hey, where are your friends?" I, being stupid, told them I didn't have any friends there, just my relatives, and pointed in the direction of the beach. They walked far enough away that I couldn't see them anymore, probably about 100 feet or so. Then they started making small talk, asking about things I liked, where I lived, and my home phone number. Red flags that I would recognize today, but back then I didn't understand. I'm grateful that I didn't know my home phone number or address at that age, and I only answered questions about things I liked. I started climbing down the playset when the lady asked the question that I'll never forget. "We can be your friends, you know? Don't you want a friend who will never let you go?" Instead of screaming for help, I just hopped down the other side of the playset and ran toward my parents, calling out to them. I think I said, "Mama, Papa, look, I made some new friends." My parents and relatives had been frantically looking for me because they noticed I'd wandered off. When I called out, my mom heard me and ran toward me. I think she saw the couple too. The couple exchanged a quick look, realized I wasn't worth the trouble, and ran off toward the parking lot. My mom came to me and gave me a big hug, asking what had happened. I told her about the couple, what we talked about, and how I was sad when they ran off. My mom just sighed and called the police to report what happened. She told them about the couple and they asked me to describe them. As a kid, my descriptions were vague, and the cops left after taking the report. We packed up and headed home. On the way, my mom gave me the stranger danger talk, and this time I actually listened. I'm not sure if the couple was ever caught, but I hope they were, for the sake of kids like me. Or at least I hope it scared them enough to deter them from trying to snatch kids again, especially since they were so close to getting caught. This happened when I was around 9, though it's hard to pinpoint exact years. It wasn't the first time, nor the last, that I've witnessed strange things. But this particular event is seared into my memory. It was early in the morning, perhaps late spring or early summer. The room was filled with sunlight streaming through my bedside window, though the light had a grayish, almost misty quality to it. I had just woken up, a bit earlier than usual, but it wasn't like I was startled awake by a loud noise or anything frightening. No, at first there was nothing unusual in the room. It was basically empty, with my bed beside the window, facing an open door leading into the hallway and my parents' room. Nothing out of the ordinary. Everyone else had already left the house. I lay there, debating whether to get up or try to fall back asleep, when something suddenly lurched into the doorway. Darker than the shadow cast by the door frame, it was about 5 feet tall and appeared to wriggle like a mass of stubby tendrils, each moving in different directions. I was confused for a split second before a cold wave of dread washed over me as it gave another lurch. It wasn't floating, it was walking, person's head to be clear. A very happy person by the look of it, but not like anyone I had ever seen. Everything about it didn't add up. Its shape resembled a man wearing an old-fashioned, wide-brimmed hat, but its outline was jagged, almost like it had been hastily cut out from paper. The strange edges I had noticed were the tendrils I saw, but they appeared sharp as razors to my eyes. Were they fingers or claws? Was it solid or mist? Was it even really there? I quickly realized, despite its dark, insubstantial appearance, it had to be a shadow. But the relief of that thought vanished as I realized something had to be casting the shadow. And then it moved, finally lurching in front of my parents' room. It didn't fall from the wall to lie on the floor like a normal shadow. Its feet were clearly visible. It wasn't an intruder's shadow, small comfort though that was. Whatever this thing was, it was walking upright in the hallway. A pressure built in my head as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't just the shadowy color or the almost translucent quality that led me to think it was a shadow. This thing was flat, yet it was clearly existing in all 3 dimensions, completely defying logic. And then there was the fact that it seemed to be grinning, though it had no mouth or eyes, just hollow holes where they should have been. I assumed it would continue down the hall, toward my older sister's room. But then, it did the worst thing it had done up to that point. Turned. Slowly, with that same jerky motion, its head and neck began to twist. I half expected to hear the crackling of stiff joints, though there was no sound at all. In fact, everything felt strangely muffled ever since it appeared. At first, it was gradual, but then, all of a sudden, its gaze locked directly onto me. Its head flickered in and out, as though it was only visible from certain angles. I wasn't exaggerating when I said it was flat, and I wasn't foolish enough to believe it couldn't see me. I wanted to hide, or maybe even try to escape if it came into the room, but I couldn't move. It wasn't that I was hesitating. I was willing myself to move, but the thought never seemed to make it to my limbs. Then it took a step forward. The spell broke. In a moment of pure desperation, I threw the covers over my head. Maybe it was the child's logic that if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me, but honestly, I didn't expect the blanket to do anything other than shield me from the horror I was certain was about to unfold. It's a strange feeling, being that young and suddenly thinking you're about to die violently. I imagined it would reach me at any second. Would it feel like being impaled by a sharp knife, or would my flesh burn away under its smoky touch? But nothing happened. I stayed there, shaking under my blanket fort, wondering if it was truly gone or if it was just standing there, waiting for me to peek, perhaps with its grotesque face hovering inches from mine. I couldn't know for sure unless it moved, could materialize out of nowhere, and I wouldn't even see it coming. Either way, I knew this wouldn't end until I did something, so I slowly lowered the blankets, and when I looked out, everything seemed ordinary. The dread had lessened, and the birds outside were chirping again at their normal volume. I climbed out of bed, trying to steady my nerves, constantly checking over my shoulder to make sure it wasn't lurking, hidden in the shadows with its unnatural flatness. I crept to the door, took a deep breath, and peeked my head out, glancing quickly to my sister's room, then around the house. Nothing. Her door was closed, but I couldn't be sure that would stop whatever it was. I figured I'd rather face it head-on than risk it sneaking up on me again, so I cautiously peeked inside her room. Still nothing. What followed was a search of the entire house and yard. I looked everywhere, expecting to find it around every corner, under every piece of furniture, or maybe even to have it burst out from beneath my feet. But it never appeared. I briefly considered checking the forest, but I couldn't tell if that was pure paranoia or a reckless move at that point. Years went by, and I never encountered it again, though I couldn't shake the discomfort of being in my room with the door open. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about what happened. So did I, but they were never answered. It's not like I could summon it back, or even if I could, I wouldn't. You might have suggestions, but I've never figured out what it was. Maybe it was a ghost or some kind of demon from another dimension. Perhaps it was just a sleep paralysis episode. I'm not sure what it was, and I'm open to hearing your thoughts. But no offense, I honestly hope I never find out. This happened when I was 13. I lived in a duplex with my dad and older brother. It was a 2-bedroom place, and I shared a room with my dad while my brother had his own. It wasn't unusual for both of them to have plans at night while I stayed home alone, playing video games. That night was no different. My dad was probably out at a bar, and my brother was doing who knows what. I was playing the original Resident Evil on PlayStation, and around midnight, I started getting tired and decided to go to bed. I kept my bedroom door wide open. Now, in the years we lived there, neither my dad nor my brother ever came home through the back sliding glass door. A couple of times, my brother didn't have his key and would knock on my bedroom window, asking me to let him in. My dad always had his key and used the front door. But on this night, I heard the back door slide open. It was an old door, and sliding it open was difficult. It was also very loud, so I heard it clearly. I stayed still in bed, wide awake, as my mind started racing. I heard someone walk through the dining room, across the kitchen, and into the living room. They didn't even try to be quiet. After a brief pause, I saw someone walk past my bedroom doorway. That sight terrified me. My heart was pounding. Whoever was in the house then walked into the bathroom, which was right next to my bedroom, and flipped the light on. The light shone right into my room, leaving me exposed in bed, frozen in fear. Why didn't I scream for my brother or dad? Because, as I mentioned, I knew it wasn't them, and it didn't make sense for anyone else to be there. Not a family member, not a friend. I knew it was someone who didn't belong. The person then left the bathroom, leaving the light on, and went into my brother's room. I could hear them rummaging around, searching for something. I just lay there, shivering in fear. After a few more minutes, the person walked past my bedroom again. I expected at any moment for them to come into my room, but they didn't. I could hear them moving around the living room, huffing and puffing, and then pacing back and forth by my bedroom. They went into the bathroom and out again and again. At that point, I was 100% sure they were messing with me. They knew I was there. I could hear the sounds they made, and by the figure I saw walking back and forth, I could tell it was a man. The person continued moving through every room except mine. Then, suddenly, I heard them walk back through the house, open the back sliding door, and leave. I lay there in bed, terrified, trying to process what had just happened. After what felt like forever, I eventually fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. In the morning, I found that both my dad and brother were home. I've asked them both dozens of times, and they both swear it wasn't them. And once again, why would they have used the back door only to leave through it again? This was 21 years ago, and I'll never know who it was or why they were there. The weirdest part? Nothing was missing, and they never came into my room. The door was wide open, and they walked by it at least 20 times. In October 2019, I attended a Halloween costume ball at our local art gallery, organized by a Unitarian Universalist spiritual center. It was a pretty typical party, though it had some ceremonial elements to honor Samhain. I dressed as the Red Death from the Phantom of the Opera and went solo, though a friend eventually joined me later on. But before they arrived, I had an experience that still leaves me puzzled. I can't come up with a clear explanation for it, even now. After dancing and enjoying a couple of drinks, I decided to get a photographic aura reading from a woman running a booth. I sat down, and she told me to remove my skull mask and place my palms on a silver machine connected to her laptop. Then I was instructed to look into the camera. A few minutes later, my image appeared on the screen, overlaid with a mix of transparent colors and various charts. I was fascinated and listened closely as the woman explained chakras and other concepts. However, something caught my attention in my peripheral vision. I looked up, and to my surprise, a group of 4 people sitting at a nearby table were staring and smiling at me. 3 men and a woman. Their expressions weren't friendly. They were downright unsettling. They didn't even blink. I felt a shiver, especially since I was still wearing my skull mask. I didn't bother acknowledging them, so I just turned my focus back to the woman's lecture about my aura. But even as I listened, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced ahead again, and sure enough, the same group was still there, staring at me, grinning without a word. They didn't gesture or signal me in any way. I blinked, but they were still sitting there, not moving a muscle. I swear I had never seen them before. I had no idea who they were or why they were staring at me so intensely. The woman eventually wrapped up the session, and I paid her before heading to the restroom, trying my best to shake off the odd experience as nothing. Afterward, my friend found me, and we spent some time chatting until he had to leave for his mother's birthday. That's when I realized the group hadn't approached me at all after my aura reading. Out of sheer curiosity, I spent some time searching the venue, but I never found them again. I'll always wonder what that was about. This happened 4 years ago when I was 12, almost 13. My friend, Sally, who was 14 at the time, played a big role in this story. I was staying with her that night. At that age, the 2-year age difference felt pretty significant. I was just starting my 2nd year of middle school, while Sally was about to begin her sophomore year of high school. I met her at the beginning of my 1st year at a new school. She was older than the other kids in our grade, one of the more popular students, and I think that's what first drew me to her. We quickly became close friends, and before long, we were spending every weekend together. Seriously, every weekend. Nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary. It was just your typical Friday night. After school, we carpooled back to our family's apartment. I've always been a picky eater, so when it came time for dinner, I didn't eat with the family. I just snacked on a Pop-Tart I'd stashed away in my backpack, just in case they ordered something I wouldn't eat. One thing to note is that Sally's family was pretty religious. I wouldn't say they were fanatical, but they didn't allow their kids to watch horror movies or anything rated PG-13 or R. It wasn't because they wanted to protect them from something inappropriate, though. Sally's mom had an irrational fear that scary movies carried hidden messages. When we asked to watch The Purge, her mom obviously said no. After a little back and forth, Sally's mom agreed to let us watch The Hunger Games instead. After the movie, Sally and I went to hang out in our room. She put on some music and, being the age we were, we gave each other makeovers. By the end of it, we looked much older than our actual ages, 12 and 14. But this is the part of the night when things started to feel off to me. Sally, while my best friend at the time, wasn't the most positive influence. She had a manipulative side and got a strange satisfaction from putting me down. She also had a habit of talking to men online and lying about her age. One night, she showed me some texts between her and a man she had been talking to. I can't remember the exact details, but they were unsettling. He was trying to convince her to meet up, and they had all the usual red flags you'd expect from a creep online. According to him, he was 19, tall and blonde with soulful blue eyes. Once I saw the texts, I asked if she had a picture of him. Something did not sit right with me after seeing the messages. She showed me what he looked like, and he was very clearly not 19. This man was at least 40 and looked like he lived in his mother's basement. That night, we got a call from him. Sally answered without hesitation, And when I heard the voice on the other end of the call, I felt like I was going to be sick. "You're so pretty. Why don't you come meet me?" Sally said that she couldn't because she was spending the night with a friend. The mention of that sparked his interest, and then he proceeded to try and ask us both to meet him. Sally, lacking any common sense, said yes. Thus begun her plan for us to sneak out and walk 15 blocks to meet him in a deserted McDonald's parking lot. I did not want to go. I was raised on stories of what happens to teen girls who meet random men from the internet in person. But after adamant pleading from Sally that she didn't feel safe going by herself, I agreed. We took our phones with us for the walk. I had a kitchen knife hidden on me in case something were to happen, and I needed to defend myself. The route that we had to take to get there didn't have very many street lamps, and there weren't any houses. We were surrounded by trees on both sides of us. When we got to the parking lot, the only car parked nearby was a black beat-up 2000 Toyota Corolla. The car was still running when we got there, and from what we could tell, there was more than just one person inside. The man from the picture got out of the front passenger seat and left the door open behind him before approaching us. I turned my flash on so I could see, and he was obviously on something. I can't tell you what it was, but his eyes were so wide, they looked like they were about to pop out of his head. He was jittery and kept twitching. I became very conscious of how big he was, maybe 6'2", around 280 pounds. For reference, my friend and I did not look our ages even without makeup. I'm about 5'2", and my friend was taller, probably around 5'6", but we were both significantly smaller than this man. He reached out for us and caught my friend by the arm. I went to get my knife as quickly as I could, and that's when I saw his friends getting out of the car. He invited us back to his car and offered us booze and drugs. But after seeing my knife and that I was ready to call the police, he released my friend. I took Sally's arm and ran faster than I ever had in my life. We took the long way home to avoid them finding out where she lived in case they were following us. Once we got there, her family was still sound asleep. We locked all the doors, closed the blinds, and blocked him on everything. There wouldn't be any sleeping that night. We were constantly peeking out the window, and to our dismay, that same Toyota was circling around her apartment building. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. I never mentioned any of this to my parents out of fear of getting grounded or in some kind of trouble. I'm 16 now, and they still have no idea. I still get nervous when I see a car similar to the one from that night. As for Sally, her parents never found out either. We agreed to never speak about it again. Thankfully, she moved into a new house just a few weeks after that happened. It's safe to say that Sally and I haven't spoken in years. She was upset at me for ruining her night, and our friendship did not last long after that. We had a pretty bad falling out, but looking back on it now, it was definitely for the better. Who knows what would have happened if I wasn't with her that night, and who knows what those men were truly planning. In 2015, I managed to land my dream job as the manager of this really old, rustic pub. The kind with stained glass windows, ornate bar fixtures, and all the charm you'd expect from a place with a history. But not long after I started, the pub was bought by a big brewery company, and soon after, they decided to clean house. So, within 6 months of landing my dream job, I lost it. I was devastated. I had rent and bills to pay, and I was desperate to find something, anything, to make ends meet. So, I ended up taking a job at a 24-hour off license in the middle of town, working the night shift from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. This place was busy, to say the least. It had a cash machine inside, sold premium bottles of booze at eye-watering prices, and was mostly a cash business. It was the place where anyone who wanted to keep drinking after the bars closed would stop by to grab a few bottles before heading home in a taxi. I'm not exaggerating when I say that we sometimes had up to $7,000 in cash on site by the end of the busiest part of the night shift. And when I say we, I mean me, because I worked that shift completely alone. It was Sunday morning, around 5 a.m., just before Christmas. The off-license had been incredibly busy that night, so much so that we had way more than $7,000 in cash on hand, almost like it had been Black Friday, which in the UK is the last Friday before Christmas. All the office parties had been in town, spending big, and almost everyone wanted to take booze home with them too. There were even queues going out the door at one point. Seriously, it was one of the busiest shifts I'd ever worked, including in pubs. By the time things started to quiet down, I was ready to collapse. I remember just resting my head on the counter, feeling like I could fall asleep right there. Then I heard the little beep of the door opening. Although I would have rather flushed my head down the toilet than serve another drunk customer at that point, I forced myself to prepare for one more. I looked up, and standing in front of me was a guy who seemed oddly sober. Normally, on those Saturday night shifts, most people were plastered. Glazed eyes, slurred speech, barely able to stand. But this guy, he was shockingly lucid. It was strange. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets the entire time he was talking, which only made things feel more off. What made it even weirder was when he greeted me by name. I thought he might have known me, but I didn't recognize him. So I remained polite and say something like, "Yeah, that's me. How do you know that?" Then he once again refers to me by name and follows up by telling me where I live. Again, I'm like, "How do you know that?" Only this time, I'm thinking that this could be a plainclothes policeman or something, and I had done something wrong, like accidentally sold a bottle of booze to someone under 18, maybe even failed one of those underage tests that the police try on occasion to catch businesses out. Then he starts asking about my mom and then refers to her by name and asks about my sister, again, knowing her name too. He asks me if they're still living at such and such address, then gives their exact street address. I then apologize and tell him that I just didn't recognize him, figuring that he was an old family friend or something that I had forgotten all about. But something about him is creeping me out all the same. He didn't once take his hands out of his jacket pockets, like to the point it was getting sort of odd. People talk with their hands all the time, and this guy's hands were like wedged into those front pockets on his jacket. That's when these other guys walked in who also seemed weirdly sober. They were quiet and deliberate in their movements, just pacing towards the counter and flanking the guy who seemed to know a little bit too much about me. Then, really politely, the guy who seemed to know all about where I lived and where my family lived asks me if there's a toilet in the back of the shop. I told him there was, and he tells me to walk back into it, lock the door, and not come out for at least half an hour. And just to make it clear that he's not really asking me, he shows me that he's holding something inside of his jacket, something heavy. Only then do I realize what's happening. They proceed to take all the CCTV USB sticks, wreck the monitors, break into the safe, rinse the tills, empty the shelves of all the premium spirits. I mean, they absolutely robbed the place blind. All the while, I just sat in the back on the toilet, wondering how that guy knew where I lived or where my family lived. As they were leaving, I heard footsteps walking up to the toilet door and I started shaking, hard. Then I hear this voice telling me that I did the right thing for the sake of my family, and that all of the stuff they had taken was insured, that no one but the insurance companies would lose a penny, and it was them who were the real thieves anyway. I ended up telling the police that I didn't get a good look at the guy's face, that I wanted to help them, but that I just couldn't. I told them it all happened really fast and that they must have been professionals because I didn't even get a chance to hit the alarm behind the counter. They must have gotten away with like $10 all in all. And it didn't even take an hour for them to do it, more like 15 or 20 minutes. And they had managed to make sure that the one person capable of identifying them wouldn't say a thing to anyone about it. Like, I can't even tell you how frightening it was that they had managed to work out where my mom and sister lived. People who put that kind of work into criminality, they really are not to be messed with. And besides, it's just stuff, just material stuff. It's not worth losing your life over. And it's certainly not worth risking your family's safety over. No amount of money compares to the safety of your family. Last summer, I went to a house party in the Gary Owen neighborhood of Limerick, Ireland. It was right in the middle of lockdown, and I know it was reckless and selfish of me to go, but I was desperately in need of a break from the isolation. I'm a social person, and being stuck inside on my own was driving me mad. I really regret going, but breaking the lockdown rules isn't the reason I wish I hadn't gone. No, what I saw at that party was one of the most terrifying and disturbing things I've ever witnessed, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. The party was going fine for the first few hours, and I was happily chatting and mingling as I tend to do. But then I walked into the kitchen to grab another drink, and that's when I saw a heated argument unfolding between a couple. It seemed to be over allegations of infidelity. The tension was thick, and it felt incredibly awkward to be there with them. So, I quietly grabbed my bottle of wine from the fridge and returned to the area where I had been talking with some new friends. I didn't think much of it. House parties can be strange like that. One room had people passed out, another had people dancing, and in some, there were minor arguments between couples that never went beyond words. But this one escalated. The guy involved in the argument stormed out of the party, and for a few hours, everything returned to normal. The vibe was back to being fun, but later in the night, he returned. By then, people knew who he was, so they didn't think twice about letting him back in. I doubt anyone had any idea what he was about to do. Otherwise, they would have never allowed him back into the house. He started searching the house for the girl he had been fighting with. I'm not even sure if they were a couple. What I overheard was just them arguing about sleeping around. When he found her, he confronted her, screaming at her. And then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a bottle, and proceeded to pour whatever was inside all over her. People assumed he was just being a jerk and throwing vodka at her. The outrage came from both the wasted alcohol and his excessive aggression. But that's not where it ended. He then legs it from the room while she's screaming. From the people I've spoken to about it, the ones that were in the room when it happened, they first thought her screaming was her being a bit melodramatic about having some drink chucked on her face. But then she took her hands away from her face and it's covered in what looks like burns. It wasn't alcohol he had thrown onto her face that night. It was acid. Luckily, someone there was a chemistry graduate. They realized what was happening almost straight away and then grabbed something from under the kitchen sink that would neutralize the acid. I don't know what it was exactly, but it was some other chemical that probably didn't do her much good either. But it definitely stopped the damage from being any worse than it was. I heard the poor girl had to have a skin graft from her leg though. Like, even with the help she got, her injuries were absolutely horrific. The guy who did it went on the run for a bit too. Like the Gardaí, what we call the police in Ireland, didn't manage to get cuffs on him for like a month. And we were all so relieved when they finally did. I can't imagine what kind of monster does something like that after an argument. To use actual acid to try to permanently disfigure someone's face, that takes a really special kind of evil. Don't you think? When I was about 11, I started having awful recurring nightmares about a terrifying figure. The dreams always began the same way. I would be doing something that filled me with joy, though I can't remember the exact details of those moments. At the peak of that feeling, something would shift like a scene straight out of a slasher film. As a child, I was incredibly sensitive to anything bloody or disturbing. I remember my brother and sister tried to help me get used to that kind of humor by sitting me down to watch an episode of Family Guy. But it was the one where Peter and the chicken fought, and it was so violent and gory that I completely freaked out. I say this to give you some context. I was easily disturbed back then. But back to the dream. As something satisfying was about to end, a deep bass would fill the air, and everyone around me would be overtaken by what I can only describe as a primal fear. The expressions on their faces would make me collapse into tears, and I'd cover my eyes, but I could still hear what was happening. It sounded like a slaughterhouse. Blood spilling, the awful, sharp pain of head-splitting screams and cries. It was honestly just horrific. After what felt like an eternity of hearing my loved ones being slaughtered, the bass would suddenly stop, and then I'd hear the sound of someone quietly running around, snickering to themselves. It was like a child playing hide and seek, but the footsteps would eventually fade into complete silence. The quiet would be so thick you could feel the tension, as their feet would settle on the floor, whether carpet or otherwise. This would always happen in different places, with the figure walking toward my back. It would stop about 3 feet behind me, for reasons I never understood. Then, after what felt like a long pause, they'd speak, but the words were always different. Here are a few I remember. Asterisk, I'm sorry. Asterisk, asterisk. Yeah, we've all heard it. Asterisk, asterisk. Sorry, I'm busy. Asterisk, and the one that stuck with me the most. Asterisk. So, Is it Sunday yet? Asterisk sometimes the voice would add more, but I can't quite recall what it was now. The voice always sounded like an older man trying to deepen his tone, but with a kind of playful, childlike edge. It wasn't too deep, but it was a bit scratchy. After that, I'd wake up, usually around 2 or 4 in the morning, unless I stayed up all night, in which case it'd be much later when I woke. This went on for a couple of months, though it felt longer. It was probably just a few weeks in reality. The nightmares didn't stop suddenly, but gradually faded. It really messed with me as a kid, and it changed me. Not in a drastic way, but I became a lot more serious and paranoid after that. Over time, it faded away, and I stopped thinking about it. Now, onto the actual experience I had. This was about 2 years ago, I think. I was living in an apartment with my mom, and I had just gone to the movies with 3 of my friends. We didn't really enjoy the film, so we left early and headed back to my place. When we arrived, we all kind of slumped onto the furniture in the bedroom after walking back. So we all sat down and I turned the TV on for my friends. As I did, I started hearing faint talking from the back, but my mom was home, so I didn't think much of it. We decided to put on a paranormal activity show since we liked that kind of movie, but honestly, we spent most of the time just talking and joking around. It was a great night, and I had a thing for one of the girls who was with us. We were getting along well all night, but in the middle of us messing around about the movie, I heard my mom call my name. I told my friends to be quiet, paused the movie, and yelled, "What, Ma?" There was no answer, so I called out louder, "Ma, what?" Again, no response, so I got up, planning to go to her room to ask what she wanted. But I stopped in the hallway when I heard this strange, guttural noise from the back of the house. The sound echoed, so I immediately knew it was coming from the bathroom. I yelled, "Mom, are you in the bathroom?" My friends laughed at this, and just as I started to turn back toward the living room, I recognized the voice. Then it hit me, my mom was actually in Chico for the night. I froze, and I'm pretty sure I had that same look on my face that I used to have in my nightmares. My friends thought my mom was just messing around, like I just seen her come out of the shower or something. But then the voice spoke loud enough for all of them to hear, and I'll never forget what it said. It was kind of a jumbled mess, but I distinctly heard it say, "Yeah, tonight I'll pick you up, then I'll rip you in half. But how? How? Rob will know. But no. How? Forget." During that whole exchange, I quickly told my friends we needed to leave, and I rushed outside while they stood there, dumbfounded and confused. The last thing I heard as I slammed the door was that final word, and I'm sure the voice would have kept going if I hadn't cut it off. I ran out to the street and immediately called my mom. She told me to call the police, so I did. The police came, did their usual checks, and then left. Obviously, there was nothing in the house. They said it was late, but it could have been our neighbors. I wanted to believe that too, but I swear the voice sounded exactly like the ones from my childhood nightmares, and it was definitely coming from my bathroom. Afterward, my friends tried to reassure me that everything was fine, though I could tell they were trying to hide their own fear. My best friend, who was supposed to stay over, suddenly got a call from his mom at midnight, telling him she needed him to come home. That night, I had that nightmare again. I forced myself to wake up right as I heard the deep bass hum. I rushed to turn on the lights and didn't get much sleep for the next week and a half. But since then, I haven't had that dream again. I know I might sound crazy, but I know I heard that thing in my house, and I'm certain my friends heard it too. I don't usually travel far from home, so this was one of the rare occasions I had to stay somewhere other than a friend or family member's house. The area I needed to stay in was small, and most of the hotels didn't look very appealing. But to my surprise, there was a house listed on Airbnb. It was my first time using the site, but the house looked like a good option, much better than the hotels. I requested the dates, and within minutes, the booking was confirmed. The following week, I set off on the drive. It was about a 14-hour trip to the town, and by the time I arrived, it was well into the night. The town felt almost deserted compared to where I'm used to living. All the lights in the houses were off, and all the stores were closed. There were no people or cars in sight. Of course, it was the middle of the night, so I didn't expect the town to be bustling, but it still felt eerie, especially since I hadn't seen it during the day. This was my first impression, and it left me with a strange feeling. The street leading to the Airbnb was dark, winding through a forested neighborhood. Eventually, I arrived at the house. It was one of the few that had its porch and outdoor lights on, and there was a light coming from one of the upstairs windows. I assumed the previous guest had just left the light on by mistake, so I didn't think much of it. I grabbed the key code from my email and unlocked the door, stepping inside and locking it behind me. I quickly placed my things in the corner of the room, then headed upstairs to turn off the light that had been left on. The upstairs room was a small, spare bedroom with only a bed and a small dresser. I switched off the light and made my way to the main bedroom to set up my things. I was only staying for one night, though I had booked it for 2 since I needed to be there into the following day. It wasn't long before I climbed into bed, hoping to get some sleep, but I found myself laying awake for a while. Suddenly, I sat up quickly, hearing a loud thud echo through the walls of the house. I stared at the door, trying to figure out what could have caused the noise, but nothing came to mind. After a moment, I decided to check it out. I opened the door quietly and peeked into the upstairs hallway. It was dark and still, with no more sounds, just the creaking of the house as the wind blew outside. I stepped back and quietly shut the door, but a strange feeling came to me that had me wait as I thought more about the sound I heard. As I stood there, soft creaks started to go along the floorboards from the other room. I listened with my ear against the door as the creaking moved into the hallway and then began making its way toward the door. I was so in shock that I almost didn't realize that it had to be footsteps of someone approaching. My heart started racing as they came right up to the other side of the door. I put my hand tightly on the door handle to keep it from moving, and only a moment later, I felt it pull down. As soon as I resisted it, they eased off. There was a small moment before suddenly, the handle was forced down and they slammed into the door. It swung half open before I pressed my body back into it. I only saw half of their face in the doorway, but in their eyes was an anger that I didn't expect to ever see. After a struggle, I somehow managed to push the door back into the latch and lock it. The man on the other side tried to get it back open, but after yelling a few unpleasant words towards me, he ran downstairs and out of the house. I was still catching my breath and my mind was racing, but I gathered myself up and dialed 911. For such a small town, they came shortly after. The owner of the Airbnb continued with the case after I left on the following day, but I wish I'd kept up with it. That man seemed so desperate to get into my room and was in some state of rage, like he wanted to hurt me as if I'd done something to him. Everything about it is disturbing, and I don't think I'll ever get it out of my head, but Airbnbs probably won't be something I take part in again for a long time. I live in a block of flats in what I consider to be a bit of a rough area. It's the kind of place where you occasionally encounter some sketchy characters. The building consists of 2 structures, one of which has the washroom where residents go to use the washing and drying facilities. I'm a 31-year-old woman, and while I don't use the facilities as often as I'd like, whenever I do go, there's this one guy who always seems to be there. The washroom tends to be busy, and it can take multiple visits to find a time when the machines aren't in use, even though it's rare to ever see anyone else in there. There's no one I've ever seen there twice, except for this man who's always washing his teddies. At first, when I saw him, he didn't say much. He looks like someone you'd try to avoid. He has visible twitches and possibly some learning difficulties. He usually doesn't engage in conversation. That is, until one time after a few run-ins, when he took his teddy out of the machine, held it up like Mr. Bean, and greeted me through the teddy. I can't exactly remember my reaction, but I tried to be as nice as possible, considering he might have special needs and might require a different approach. I've lived here for over 2 years now, and he's the only person who repeatedly shows up in the washroom. This time, I was in there before he was. He stood at the door, just watching me. I tried to make polite conversation while I was busy doing my laundry, and he stood there, giving me his full attention. When he spoke, he sounded completely normal, His tone and demeanor were different from what I'd grown used to. He started talking about how awful lockdown was, where he worked, and how he still had to go in. Just normal stuff. After a moment, though, he suddenly said quite firmly and in a frustrated tone, "I'm just trying to be socially distant." I apologize and give him plenty of room to get by. He goes to his machine beside me and takes out a teddy from his laundry, and again, like before, speaks through his teddy. I was about done filling the machine at this point and told him to take care of himself and left, feeling very rattled by the strange change in character from the man who spends all his time washing his teddies. When I returned to the washroom to put my clothes in the dryer, I'd taken my time to return, maybe 2 hours or so. I didn't want to run into the guy again by going back at the same time as him. However, when I got there, someone had been in before me and removed my clothes. They had been thrown all down the back of the washer, definitely not accidentally, and this really freaked me out. I picked it all back up, threw it in the dryer, and rushed back to my flat and told my boyfriend what had happened. He told me not to go back tonight and that he'd go to finish it off. However, he just started cooking, so it was a long time before he returned. When he went to the dryer, I'd put our clothes in. They too had been removed and thrown all down the backs of the dryers. Nothing else in the washroom had been tampered with. And to me, this said that I was targeted. The first instance, I thought that maybe someone had a bad day. But with hours between my moves and my clothes being targeted, I felt directly threatened. I know this could be coincidence, it could be nothing, but my instincts tell me something more sinister could be going on and could have been going on for a long time. With no real evidence, I can't raise an alarm with the police, but I am very scared. I'm going to continue documenting this. But what do you think? The decaying facade of the abandoned Millbrook factory loomed before us, its broken windows staring down like lifeless eyes. We were just a group of friends looking for a thrill, urban explorers on the hunt for the perfect spot for some cool photos. Little did we know we were about to stumble into something far worse than we could ever imagine. Something that would test our very will to survive and change us forever. I'm Jake, and I've always been drawn to abandoned places. There's something both eerie and captivating about a building left to crumble. Nature slowly reclaiming what humans have abandoned. So when my friends and I heard about the old Millbrook factory on the edge of town, we knew we had to check it out. There were 5 of us that day, me, my best friend Tom, his girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mike and Lizzie. We had explored before, but nothing this vast or isolated. As we neared the factory, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. The chain link fence surrounding the property was rusted and bent, easy enough to slip through. We made our way across the overgrown parking lot, our footsteps crunching on broken glass and gravel. "This place is creepy as hell," Lizzie whispered, already snapping pictures with her camera. "That's the point, right?" Mike grinned, though I could tell he was a bit uneasy too. We found a side door hanging off its hinges and slipped inside. The air inside was dark and musty, thick with years of dust and decay. Beams of sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting light on the dancing particles in the air. "Let's split up," Tom suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." I wasn't thrilled about it, but everyone else seemed eager. We agreed to meet back at the entrance in an hour and set off in different directions. I ventured deeper into the factory, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The place was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed shelves. Every step echoed ominously. More than once, I startled myself with my own reflection in a grimy window. I had just entered what looked like an old office area when I heard it. A shuffle. The movement was too heavy to be a rat or some small animal. I froze. My heart began to race. "Guys!" I called out. My voice sounding small in the vast space. No answer. I turned slowly, sweeping my flashlight around the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving quickly past a doorway at the end of the hall. It was too big to be any of my friends. Fear gripped me, but curiosity won out. I moved towards the doorway, every nerve on high alert. As I reached the threshold, I heard voices. Low, rough whispers that definitely didn't belong to any of my friends. I peered around the corner and my blood ran cold. In what must have been the factory's main floor, I saw 3 men. They were gathered around a collection of crates, passing packages between them. Even from a distance, I knew what I was seeing. This was a drug deal. I must have made a noise, a gasp, or a shifting of my feet, because suddenly one of the men looked up. Our eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Then all hell broke loose. "Hey!" the man shouted, reaching for something at his waist. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran. I could hear shouts and footsteps behind me as I tore through the factory. My mind was racing. I needed to find my friends, to warn them. We needed to get out of here now. I rounded a corner and slammed right into Tom. We both went down in a tangle of limbs. "Jake, what the hell, man?" Tom groaned, rubbing his head. "No time," I gasped, scrambling to my feet. "We need to go. Now, where are the others?" The urgency in my voice must have gotten through to him because he didn't ask any more questions. "Sarah's just down there." He pointed. "I don't know where Mike and Lizzie went. We found Sarah quickly," and I gave them a rushed explanation as we moved. Their eyes widened in fear as they realized the danger we were in. "We need to find Mike and Lizzie," Sarah said, her voice shaking. I nodded, but before we could decide on a plan, we heard a scream. It was Lizzie. We ran towards the sound, caution forgotten in our desperation to reach our friend. We burst into a large room and saw Lizzie backed into a corner, one of the men advancing on her. Mike was on the ground, not moving. Without thinking, I grabbed a piece of rusted pipe from the ground and charged. I caught the man by surprise, swinging the pipe and connecting with his shoulder. He went down with a yell of pain. "Run!" I shouted at Lizzie. She didn't need to be told twice. Tom was checking on Mike. "He's breathing," he reported. "I think he's just knocked out." The man I'd hit was getting to his feet, murder in his eyes. Behind him, I could see his 2 companions entering the room. "You kids picked the wrong place to play Explorer." One of them growled. We were trapped. The only exit was behind the men, and they were blocking our path. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. That's when I saw it. A conveyor belt leading up to a higher level. If we could get up there, maybe we could find another way out. "The belt," I hissed to Tom. "We need to get up there." He nodded, understanding immediately. On 3, he whispered, 1, 2, 3. We moved as one. Tom and I grabbed Mike under the arms and ran for the conveyor belt. Sarah and Lizzie were right behind us. The men, caught off guard by our sudden movement, took a second to react. But that second was all we needed. We scrambled up the rusted conveyor belt, the sharp edges cutting into our hands. I could hear the men shouting, their footsteps pounding as they gave chase. We reached the upper level and found ourselves in a maze of catwalks and suspended walkways. The factory stretched out below us, a labyrinth of shadows and rusted metal. "Which way?" Sarah panted. I looked around frantically. "There." I pointed to a door on the far side of the room. It was marked with a faded exit sign. We ran across the catwalks, the whole structure shaking under our feet. Behind us, I could hear the men climbing up after us. We reached the door and I yanked it open, revealing a rusted fire escape. Without hesitation, we started down. We were about halfway down when I heard a gunshot. The sound echoed through the factory, making us all flinch. "Keep moving," I shouted. We practically fell down the last few flights, our feet clanging on the metal steps. As soon as we hit the ground, we ran. We didn't stop running until we reached Tom's car, parked a few blocks away. We piled in, Mike still groggy but conscious now, and Tom peeled out of there like the devil himself was chasing us. It wasn't until we were miles away, the factory long out of sight, that we finally allowed ourselves to breathe. What just happened?" Lizzie asked, her voice barely audible. I told them everything, the drug deal, the chase, everything I had witnessed. As I spoke, the weight of the situation began to settle in, and the full reality of what we had just gone through started to sink in. We debated whether we should go to the police, but fear ultimately won out. What if those men had connections? What if they came after us, or worse, our families? In the end, we made a pact never to speak of what happened to anyone. That day changed all of us. We had set out looking for excitement and ended up finding terror. The nightmares lingered for weeks, months for some of us. Every unexpected sound made us jump. Every unfamiliar face in the street felt like a potential threat. But it also brought us closer together. We had faced death and lived to tell the tale. That kind of experience binds you in ways nothing else can. We never went urban exploring again after that. The thrill wasn't worth the danger. But sometimes, when I pass an abandoned building, I can't help but wonder what secrets it might be hiding. I shudder, remembering the day our curiosity nearly got us killed. The Millbrook factory still stands, as far as I know. A decaying relic of a fading industry, and a stark reminder of the darkness that can lie hidden in forgotten places. If you're ever tempted to explore such a spot, remember our story. Sometimes the real monsters aren't the ghosts of the past, but the very real dangers lurking in the present. To start off, I want to clarify that I've never had any problems with Uber before or since this event. This was just one strange, slightly unsettling incident. I live in a college town, and when I was attending university, I relied on Ubers for places I couldn't walk to. The campus parking security was relentless, and I definitely didn't need to add a bunch of parking tickets to my growing pile of debt. It wasn't exactly the cheapest option, but it was a surefire way to get where I needed to go without risking a ticket or being harassed. On the night this incident happened, I had been visiting a friend's house about 5 miles away from my dorm. I requested an Uber like usual, and a guy in his mid-20s showed up to pick me up. I followed my typical safety routine, checked his name, license plate, confirmed my details. Everything seemed fine. The guy had the Uber light on top of his car, so it was clearly him. I hopped in, and almost immediately he started a conversation. I don't mind talking with my Uber drivers, and I always try to be polite, but this guy started asking a lot of questions right off the bat. First, the usual stuff. Where are you from? Are you in college? All standard questions. Then, out of nowhere, he asks, "How much do you weigh?" I was caught off guard by that. It's definitely not a typical question to ask a stranger, and he had a thick accent, which made it even more confusing. He seemed unfamiliar with the area too, ignoring his GPS and taking strange turns, though he was generally headed in the right direction. I answered the question, laughing nervously and joking that it wasn't a question most people ask. He responded with, "Just kidding, but you're beautiful." Probably the ideal weight for me. That was when my discomfort skyrocketed. Major red flags. I should have said something, but all I could manage was an awkward laugh. I awkwardly responded, "Ideal weights fluctuate," which was a stupid thing to say, but I was just frozen in the moment. Maybe it was just a cultural thing, or maybe I was just overthinking it. To try and change the subject, I asked him a bit about himself, and he told me he was from Ukraine. He didn't need any encouragement to start talking about himself, so I went along with the usual and wow responses to keep him on track. Honestly, I found that technique works really well when you want to avoid someone who's getting too flirtatious. They get so wrapped up in talking about themselves that they forget about you. But in this case, it seemed like my vague questions were being taken as genuine interest on my part. Then he started staring at me through the rearview mirror, locking eyes for what felt like far too long. I noticed that we were veering off course, taking a much longer route to my dorm. Now I was definitely nervous. The streets were empty, it was really late, and I was alone. Still, I tried to brush it off as another cultural difference. Maybe I was too chatty, or maybe it was the way I was dressed. I picked up my phone and pretended to text, but that only seemed to encourage him further. He asked, "Do you have a boyfriend?" "Yeah, we've been together for a year." Then he asked, "Ever thought about trying the market? You're so young." "Nah, we're really happy." It's a shame, really a shame. He's still trying to maintain eye contact, leaning towards the back seat. I or something in response, and to my joy, I see we're finally approaching my dorm. The guy super slowly creeps to a stop at the curb, and I belt out the standard thanks for the ride. "I'll rate you 5 stars and go for the door handle." This guy hits the lock button and I'm locked in. I whip my head around at him, and he's turned all the way around in the seat belt off, and grinning like he just won the lottery. I'm freaked out. Your doors are still locked. He ignores me, still grinning, and asks bluntly for my phone number. I decline as politely as possible, even though I feel like knocking his lights out. No sale. He asked again, this time more forcefully and adding, I would really love to get to know you better. I can meet you right here tomorrow if you want. Once again, I decline, reminding him that I have a boyfriend, and he most definitely would not like that. So you're not allowed to have friends? We can just be friends. Lots of girls around here have friends. At this point, I'm in full panic mode. What he said sounded innocent enough, but he was borderline cornering me into his back seat and was boring holes into me with his eyes. I was afraid he'd drive off with me if I said no again, and I had no means of fighting on me. I'm tall, 5'11", but my limbs are like noodles. This dude had biceps like basketballs. There was no way I'd be able to fight him off. He asked for my phone number again. I don't decline, but blurt out, unlock your door. He starts to protest, but I repeat myself, pulling the door handle a couple of times. I raise my eyebrows at him, try to give him my best entitled face. I said, unlock it. Finally, looking crestfallen, he turns back around and slowly puts his seat belt on and unlocks the door. I bowled out of the car, slamming the door and breaking into a sprint until I'm finally locked into my dorm room. I'm freaked out for another hour or two, but I'm able to go to sleep. I woke up the next morning to a text from this guy who told me I was the most beautiful woman he had ever met and how he wished I hadn't left the car. Immediately, I block him and report him to Uber. I haven't heard anything from the guy since. The moment I caught sight of those frantic eyes peering out from the back window of the van, I knew my brief pit stop was about to take a terrifying turn. What I didn't realize at the time was that by the end of the night, I would be fleeing for my life, questioning everything I thought I knew about the peaceful highways of Middle America. I had been driving all day, heading to my sister's wedding in Colorado. I opted for a road trip instead of flying to save some money. The endless stretch of highway had put me into a kind of trance, the yellow lines blurring together as the miles piled on through the night. When I saw the sign for a rest stop ahead, I decided to pull over. My gas tank was almost empty, and my bladder wasn't far behind. Plus, I figured a little caffeine would help keep me awake for the last stretch of the journey. The rest stop was just like the countless others I'd passed during my travels. A small building with restrooms, vending machines, a couple of picnic tables, and a dimly lit parking lot. At this hour, it was nearly empty. A few semis sat parked in the distance, their drivers likely sleeping, and there was a dark van parked near the building. I pulled up to the gas pump, stretching as I got out of my car. The cool night air felt refreshing against my face after hours in the car. As I began to fill up, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. The van's back window was dirty and tinted, but I could swear I saw a face pressed against it. A woman's face, her eyes wide with what looked like terror. She seemed to be mouthing something, but the words were too faint to make out. I blinked, and the face disappeared. Had I imagined it? The long hours on the road must have been messing with my mind, I thought. Shaking my head, I finished pumping the gas. I walked towards the building to use the restroom, passing the van on the way. It was an older vehicle, rusted along the edges, with no windows except for the front and back. Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Inside the rest stop, I used the restroom and then moved toward the vending machines. As I was deciding between a Coke and a coffee, the door swung open suddenly. A man walked in, his eyes quickly scanning the room. He was tall, lean, with a scruffy beard and clothes that had seen better days. Our eyes locked for a moment, and something in his gaze sent a chill down my spine. There was desperation there, a barely contained aggression. Then he blinked, and it vanished, replaced by a forced grin. "Evening," he grunted. "Nice night for a drive," I replied, my voice coming out shaky as I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. He walked past me toward the restroom, and I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Something was terribly off. I grabbed my coffee quickly and headed back to my car. As I passed the van again, I heard it, a faint thumping sound coming from inside. I paused, straining my ears. There it was again, followed by what sounded like a muffled cry. My heart started racing. The face in the window, the strange man, the sounds from the van, it all added up to something sinister. I knew I should just get in my car and drive away, pretend I hadn't seen or heard anything, but I couldn't. If someone was in trouble, I couldn't just leave them. I approached the van cautiously, my phone in my hand, 911 already dialed and ready to call. As I got closer, the thumping got louder. I reached out, my hand shaking, and knocked on the side of the van. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Is someone in there? Do you need help?" The thumping stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then so quietly, I almost missed it. A woman's voice. "Please help us." My blood ran cold. There was more than one person in there. Before I could respond, I heard the rest stop door slam open. The man was back, and he did not look happy. "Hey," he shouted, starting to run towards me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I didn't think, I just acted. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I heard the man's footsteps getting closer. I managed to get the door open and threw myself inside, locking it just as the man reached me. He slammed his hands on my window, his face contorted with rage. "Mind your own business," he snarled. "You don't know what you're messing with." I started the engine, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The man stepped back as I put the car in reverse, but his eyes never left mine. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I could see him in my rear-view mirror running back to the van. My mind was racing as I sped down the highway. What had I just stumbled upon? A kidnapping? Human trafficking? Whatever it was, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just drive away and leave those people in that van. I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I'd seen to the dispatcher. They told me to keep driving, that they were sending patrol cars to the rest stop. But as I hung up, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror, headlights that were getting closer at an alarming speed. It was the van. My heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. I pressed down harder on the gas pedal, pushing my old car to speeds it was never designed for. But the van was faster, slowly but surely gaining on me. I weaved through the sparse traffic, ignoring the angry honks from the other drivers. The van stayed right on my tail, so close I couldn't even see its headlights in my mirrors anymore. Suddenly, I saw a sign for an upcoming exit. Without thinking, I swerved across 2 lanes of traffic and took the exit ramp at a speed that had my tires squealing. In my rearview mirror, I saw the van overshoot the exit. I bought myself some time, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they figured out where I'd gone. The exit led to a small town, its streets deserted at this late hour. I turned randomly, taking rights and lefts without any real plan, just trying to put as much distance between me and the van as possible. After a few minutes of this, I found myself on a dark residential street. I pulled over, killing the lights and engine. My hands were shaking as I tried to figure out what to do next. Should I keep driving? Try to find a police station? Go back to the highway and hope to run into the patrol cars the dispatcher had sent? As I sat there paralyzed with indecision, I saw headlights approaching. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the outline of the van. It was driving slowly down the street as if searching for something. Searching for me. I slouched down in my seat, praying they wouldn't notice my car. The van crawled past so close I could have reached out and touched it. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle until the red taillights had disappeared around a corner. Once I was sure they were gone, I started my car again, this time with a plan. I needed to get back to the highway to find those patrol cars. It was the only way to help the people trapped in that van. As I navigated back through the town, my mind kept replaying the events of the night, the face in the window, the sounds from the van, the man's rage when he caught me snooping. What kind of monster was he? And how many others like him were out there prowling the highways, preying on the vulnerable? I made it back to the highway, my eyes constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of the van. As I merged onto the road, I saw the most beautiful sight, flashing blue and red lights up ahead. The patrol cars had found me. I pulled over, waving desperately as the officers approached. The words tumbled out in a rush. Everything I could remember about the van, the man, the eerie sounds I'd heard. The officers listened, their faces serious. They told me I had done the right thing by calling it in, that they would issue an APB for the van. But as I sat there, watching more patrol cars race past with their lights flashing, a sense of dread settled in my gut. It was too late. The van could be anywhere by now. As dawn crept up, casting a pale light over the highway, my mind kept drifting back to the people in the van. Were they still alive? Would they ever be found? And how many other vans were out there, concealing dark secrets behind their tinted windows? I never made it to my sister's wedding. After everything I'd been through, it didn't seem to matter anymore. Instead, I found myself telling my story to anyone who would listen: police, the FBI, the media. I wanted the world to know what was happening on our highways, at our rest stops, just out of sight. Some nights, I still wake up drenched in cold sweat. The image of those terrified eyes pressed against the van's window seared into my memory. Every time I see a van on the road now, I can't help but wonder, who's inside? And are they crying out for help that will never reach anyone? The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was the wind. I had just moved into a small town nestled against the edge of an ancient forest, a place untouched by time. My new house was old but sturdy, perched at the end of a narrow road that led directly into the dense trees. The locals had warned me about the forest, how easy it was to get lost, how deep it stretched beyond what any map could track. But they never mentioned the whispers. It started the first night, a soft murmuring just beyond the tree line. It was barely audible at first, like a conversation carried by the wind, unintelligible and fleeting. I dismissed it as rustling leaves, my mind playing tricks on me in the unfamiliar darkness. Then it got closer. By the third night, the whispers drifted right to my bedroom window. The same low, rhythmic murmur, words I couldn't understand. I pressed my ear against the glass, heart hammering, but the moment I did, they stopped. Silence, heavy, waiting. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I walked into town, casually bringing it up to the shopkeeper at the general store. "Do you hear anything strange at night?" I asked. The old woman behind the counter froze mid-motion, her fingers tightening around a can of coffee. She didn't look at me, just shook her head and muttered, "Stay out of the woods." I tried again with my neighbor, a man in his 50s who had lived there his whole life. He just gave me a long, unreadable look and said, "You didn't answer them, did you?" I laughed nervously. "Of course not." He exhaled, relieved. "Then you're still fine. For now." I didn't ask what he meant. I should have. That night, the whispers returned. But this time, they were calling my name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. Just a hushed, coaxing murmur, curling against the walls of my house like an invitation. I stayed in bed, hands clenched under the blankets, refusing to move. The air in my room grew heavy, charged, like the moment before a storm. The whispering grew clearer, shifting into something almost recognizable. "Come see." I squeezed my eyes shut, willed it to stop. But the moment I did, I heard it inside the room. "Come see." I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up. My front door was wide open. I convinced myself I had forgotten to lock it, that I was sleepwalking, exhausted, overwhelmed from the stress of moving. But deep down, I knew better. Still, I stayed. I stopped mentioning the whispers to anyone. I kept my doors locked. I ignored the murmurs that pressed against my windows. I tried to live as if nothing was wrong. Then, one evening, I found footprints in the dirt outside my house. Bare footprints. They led from the tree line to my porch, and then back into the forest. That night, the whispers were different, more insistent, more eager. the sound of many voices overlapping, pressing in, waiting. Come see. I held my breath, stayed frozen in bed. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through my house. And the last thing I heard before everything went silent, a whisper right against my ear. You waited too long. The door creaked open, and the whispering finally stopped. I woke up in the forest, damp earth beneath my back, the scent of moss and decay filling my lungs. The trees loomed above me, ancient and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I sat up too fast, my head spinning. My house was nowhere in sight, only trees, thick, endless. The whispers returned, circling me like a current in the air. You came. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering. Who's there? My voice was swallowed by the trees, deadened by the thick air. The whispers continued, weaving through the trees like unseen figures passing just beyond my sight. We've waited. A rustling sound behind me. I turned, but there was nothing. Then movement, a shadow shifting between the trees, the silhouette of a figure, too tall, too thin, its limbs moving in unnatural, jerking motions. I backed away. I don't belong here. The whispering grew louder, closer. The voices layered over one another, suffocating in their urgency. Come deeper. Something brushed against my arm. I ran. The forest twisted around me, the trees closing in, the whispers turning into something more than voices. Laughter, sobs, breathless gasps. My feet pounded against the earth, but no matter how far I ran, the trees never ended. Then up ahead I saw it. A door, standing alone in the middle of the woods. It was my front door. I didn't question it. To give some context to this story, I've always been uneasy about this house. Before the family moved in, a couple of friends and I broke in to explore it. The stairs to the second floor are on the far right side, just inside the front door. They lead up to an open loft area with a small divider separating a sitting space and a short hallway. At the end of the hallway, there's a bathroom, and behind it, a bedroom located directly above the master bedroom downstairs, which would eventually be used by his mother. In the loft area, just beyond the banister, is a small door that leads to the attic. Even after they moved in, I always felt uncomfortable near that door. But there's more to this story, so let me explain a few things that led up to the final event. Every night, around 2 or 3 a.m., the attic door would open on its own. My friend often slept on the sofa in the loft, and the light inside the attic would shine through the door, waking him up. When he was in his bedroom, the sound of the door creaking open would wake him as well, and it was always left standing open the next morning. One day, while he was in the kitchen downstairs, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A small, white figure, maybe a foot and a half tall, humanoid in shape. When he looked over, it darted into the front room by the door. He didn't go searching for it, but his mother later told him that his father had seen the exact same thing and chased after it. He even moved the couch, thinking it might be hiding behind it, but it was gone. There were no other exits from that room. One day, his mother had a friend over, and they decided to play some church music and pray. It turned out that her room had all kinds of strange happenings, mostly noises, but the clothes in her closet would sway back and forth on their own. That's likely why they were praying. My friend didn't want to tell his parents about what he was seeing, assuming they'd think he was on drugs or something. His father, who didn't live with them, didn't confide in the mother until much later. Most of the strange events didn't start happening until after they had settled in. The mother kept her experiences to herself because she had finally found a good home for her kids and didn't want to scare them. So the praying began, most likely as an attempt to cleanse the house or seek divine protection, or at least that's what makes sense to me considering everything that happened. Then, during one of these prayers, the music suddenly stopped. Loud footsteps echoed across the second floor, heading toward the bedroom, and then the bedroom door slammed incredibly hard. The mother's friend immediately left, and she called the father from her car. After that, she was never in the house alone again. Not long after, the mother decided to leave, taking the younger son with her. She offered to let the older son stay and keep the house for free. When he was 19, despite the strange attic door and the unsettling things that had happened before, he thought, hell yeah, and decided to stay in the house. Fast forward a year or so, and after inviting several people to live with him rent-free, they all eventually left for various reasons. One night, he found himself alone again in the house. Around 3 a.m., he was banging on our door, begging to stay with us. That was over 20 years ago, and this is what he told me yesterday about that night. At that time, he was sleeping in the master bedroom, his mom's old room. He had been experiencing the noises and the swaying clothes in the closet, but he'd been trying to ignore it. On that particular night, he heard the bedroom door open upstairs, followed by slow footsteps moving toward the stairs. He thought maybe someone had broken in, and he began to figure out what to do. From what he could tell, whoever it was stopped at the top of the stairs, so the front door was out. He considered making a run for the back door when he started hearing the stairs creak, one by one, like someone was walking down them. At that point, he froze. His bedroom door was open, and he could see down the hall, but not directly at the stairs. Then, suddenly, he saw a dark, smoky presence in the hallway. It was mostly formless, and it moved along the wall toward his room, momentarily disappearing to the right of the door. Then, two giant talons, like those of a massive eagle, gripped the door frame. One set above the door, another set below. Next, a head appeared, smoky but almost white with pure black eyes. When it saw him, it visibly frowned. Terrified, he jumped through the window to escape. I can confirm the timing of his panic, as his window was shattered, and the bushes outside were all messed up from where he had pushed through them. But honestly, I've never heard of anything like what he described seeing before. Does anyone have any ideas? This happened to me 4 years ago in 2012, while I was in the hospital for reasons I'd rather not get into. It's not an interesting story, but what happened while I was there is what's worth sharing. One morning, I woke up early, before the sun had come up, and saw that there was another girl in the room with me. She wasn't there before. She was lying in her bed, and she appeared to be crying. For the longest time, I just stayed quiet, but eventually, I asked, "Hi, are you okay?" I realized that was a pretty dumb question, considering she was in the hospital, crying. She responded, saying she didn't feel good. I told her I was sorry, adding that I didn't feel good either. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't answer. I introduced myself as Katie and asked for her name. She said, "Julie." She kept crying, and I just laid there, feeling bad for her. But there was nothing I could do. Eventually, I fell back asleep. When I woke up again, she was gone. It was really strange, but I just shrugged it off at the time. That day, I was excited because I was finally leaving after being there for a few days. I laid in bed, watching TV until my mom and sister arrived. They came in with a doctor and a nurse, and they asked how I was feeling. My mom and sister hugged me, and I told everyone I felt great and was ready to go home. I got up to change in the restroom, and when I came out, I asked the doctor about the girl who had been in my room earlier that morning. He said he didn't know who she was and that there was no other girl in my room. He speculated that maybe another doctor had temporarily moved her into my room, but she had been relocated once another room became available. I shrugged it off. As I was leaving, I passed the nurse's station and asked the nurse who had been helping me for the past few days about the girl in my room. She told me she had passed away. I was shocked and asked when it happened. The nurse told me it had been 6 days. I was confused and said, "But there was another girl in my room earlier today. What was her name?" The nurse looked at me and said, "Julie." From 5th to 9th grade, my best friend Natalie and I were inseparable. We lived just a few streets apart in a picturesque little town in the Midwest, the kind of place that felt like a scene from a 1950s movie. Charming homes with meticulously maintained gardens, towering maple and oak trees lining every street, neighbors greeting each other as they walked their dogs or mowed their lawns, summer block parties, and kids playing outside until dinner. Every day, Natalie and I walked to and from school together, and I'd often hang out at her house for an hour or two after school while my parents were still working. I loved being at her place, especially since her mom was the kindest person. She'd always make us the best snacks. We'd gossip about the latest middle school drama, and she'd even let us watch TV or play a computer game before we tackled our homework. Natalie's dad worked a lot, so he wasn't around much, but whenever I did interact with him, something about him seemed off, though nothing was overtly alarming. He was always polite, friendly, and even had a good sense of humor. He'd joke around with Natalie, me, and our other friends when he was around, but despite everyone else seeming perfectly at ease, I couldn't shake a feeling of discomfort whenever he was near. For one thing, he was a little too touchy-feely. It wasn't blatant, but there were small things that made me uneasy. For instance, one weekend he took me, Natalie, and two of our friends to a cider mill. We picked apples, drank cider, and went on a hayride. When it was time to get off the wagon, he helped each of us down, and when I was last in line, I noticed how he'd help my friends off by putting his hands on their waists, lingering just a second too long after they were safely on the ground. Felt wrong. When it was my turn, I jumped off quickly, before he could even touch me. He looked a little confused, but didn't say anything. Then came Natalie's 12th birthday party. She had a sleepover with around 10 girls, and we laid out our sleeping bags in her living room, the biggest room in the house. The living room wasn't completely separated from the rest of the house. It opened into the front hallway, and I ended up sleeping near that opening. I wasn't thrilled about it, since I liked being surrounded by people at sleepovers, and I've always had a fear of the dark. It made me feel safer to be close to others. In the middle of the night, I was stirred by the feeling of a hand pressing against my arm. I didn't startle awake, but I opened my eyes and looked around at the other girls. Everyone was sound asleep, some even softly snoring. Then I heard soft giggling from behind me. Now fully awake and terrified, I turned to face the hallway. The opening in the wall that connected the living room to the hallway was an arch, and from the corner of my eye, I could just make out the top of a man's head peeking out, only a few feet from the ground. His fingertips were touching the wooden floor. He was crouching. It was Natalie's dad. I froze in place. I honestly had no idea what to do. Was he just kidding around? Didn't it occur to him how creepy this was? Do I say something or just awkwardly ignore it and try to fall back asleep? Being my timid, non-confrontational preteen self, I decided to go the latter route. I turned back on my other side, scooted in as close as I could to my friend sleeping next to me, and somehow managed to fall back asleep despite being obviously and understandably petrified. I'm not sure how long it was before I was woken up again, this time by a firm tapping on my temple. Knowing who it was this time around, I tried my best not to indicate that I was awake, struggling to keep my eyes closed and my breathing slow and deep. Again, I heard the same stifled giggling. The sound was particularly disturbing because it was almost manic, like he thought this whole routine was absolutely hilarious, and it could barely contain himself. Even though it was coming from a grown man, it had all the giddiness of a 5-year-old playing hide and go seek with his older siblings. Yet again, I had no idea what to do. I wasn't sure if he wanted me to acknowledge him or what. I turned to face the foyer again and just barely caught a glimpse of his head and fingers disappearing behind the wall in that same crouched position. More giggling. I quickly turned back and scooted even closer into my sleeping friend, partially waking her and causing her to shift around a bit. I hoped that she would wake up completely, but she just turned over and quickly drifted back off. As I pulled my sleeping bag tighter over my shoulders, I heard what sounded like someone shuffling on all fours down the hallway. I don't remember how I got back to sleep that night, but I somehow did, and morning finally, mercifully arrived. Natalie's parents made all of us pancakes, and her dad was acting completely normal. He didn't pay any particular attention to me, but didn't make a point to ignore me either. Just interacted with me like he did with everyone else, always smiling and joking and friendly. A couple months later, Natalie had another sleepover. This time, I made sure to secure a sleeping spot in the exact center of everyone, far from the front hallway. But later that night, I abruptly woke up in the middle of a deep sleep for seemingly no reason. I had been sleeping on my back and just suddenly opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling wide awake. Almost instantly, I was overcome with the most intense feeling of dread that I have ever experienced. I felt like I couldn't move my limbs, like some invisible weighted blanket was holding my body down. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I slowly turned my head towards the front hallway. As my eyes adjusted in the darkness, I could see Natalie's dad and mom standing in the entryway, looking directly at me with the most angry, hateful expressions on their faces. They were positioned awkwardly far from each other, about 2 feet of space between them, with their arms stiff and straight at their sides. Even though they were a fair distance away from me, I'll never forget how disturbing their faces looked, contorted into pure rage that only seemed to grow in intensity the longer I allowed myself to look. Their eyes kept narrowing, and their teeth were bared in a way that reminded me of an agitated dog, gritting them so hard I thought their jaws might snap. I was frozen, unable to move, staring back for what felt like an eternity. After what seemed like forever, I finally regained control of my body, my limbs returning to normal. Without thinking, I turned away quickly and pulled my sleeping bag over my head, shaking uncontrollably. I hardly slept the rest of the night, but I never heard a sound or movement from the hallway. The next morning, everything was back to normal. Homemade pancakes, warm smiles, and an atmosphere of complete normalcy. I never told Natalie about what had happened because I was certain she'd either think I was making it up or playing some prank on her. Our friendship eventually drifted apart a few years later, coincidentally just around the time her parents got divorced. Not long ago, Natalie's parents' divorce came up in a conversation with my mom, who shared something with me. Back when Natalie and I were still close, we had taken a few small road trips with our moms. During one of those trips, I guess our moms were talking about a particularly wealthy family in our neighborhood who always appeared perfect and had a bit of an air of superiority. Natalie's mom, suspicious of their flawless image, had said something like, "In this neighborhood, you never know what goes on behind closed doors." At the time, it didn't seem like much, but now, knowing what I experienced with Natalie's parents, that comment sends a chill down my spine. This happened to me on Thursday, April 25th, and it still haunts me how strange and unsettling it was. I was alone at home, preparing for my 12 o'clock class, when I decided to open the blinds to let in some natural light. As I glanced out the window, I saw a man in his early 30s, wearing a baseball cap, pacing around my property with his hands on his hips, walking confidently in a way that seemed off. Our yard overlooks a cliff, offering a scenic view of the 5 acres of land below us in the Pacific Northwest. I was initially confused, thinking maybe he was a worker my mom had hired for the house renovations, just taking in the view. By this point, I started feeling uneasy because he had walked to the side of my house, out of sight. I went upstairs to check, and that's when I saw him in my front yard, strolling through my driveway, looking at things, inspecting my house. He still hadn't noticed me. I called my dad to ask if we had hired anyone, and he told me that he didn't know about any worker coming over and would call my mom to confirm. He promised to call me back. As I was waiting, I spotted the strange guy's car. It was a white Honda with no license plates, parked right by my front door. The man still hadn't noticed me, and he kept wandering around. I figured this was my chance to remember we had a security system, so I armed it just in case he tried anything. If he were a worker, he would have at least rung the doorbell or knocked, but he did neither. At that moment, my dad called back and confirmed that neither he nor my mom had hired anyone for today, and told me to call the police. I went downstairs, double-checked that all the windows and doors upstairs were locked, and called my local police station. When I explained the situation, the woman on the other end didn't seem too concerned and said she wouldn't send anyone, but gave me a number for the emergency dispatch line. She told me to call them. I dialed the number, only to get an automated message telling me that nobody was available, and if this was an emergency, I should call 911. At that point, I was getting really frustrated. It had been 15 minutes, and the strange guy was still walking around my house while I was home alone. Apparently, this didn't seem urgent enough for the woman I spoke to earlier. I hung up and immediately called 911. After connecting with a 911 operator, I was asked to describe the man, and only then did they start dispatching officers toward my location. The whole situation felt bizarre. It seemed like nobody was in a rush to send help while I was alone with this strange man lurking around. I asked the officer if I could stay on the line, and after what felt like an eternity, she finally alerted the police. I went back upstairs to check on the guy, and now he was sitting in his unmarked Honda, either blasting a radio show or talking loudly to someone on the phone. I could hear a deep male voice coming from his car. Out of nowhere, I heard the distinct sound of someone hanging up, and the operator was suddenly gone from the line. I was completely thrown off, but before I could process it, my phone rang with an unknown number. I thought it was the operator calling me back, so I answered. Instead, I was met with unsettling, heavy breathing. I couldn't tell who it was, but it made my blood run cold. I immediately hung up and redialed 911. Until then, I had been holding it together, but that phone call pushed me into full panic mode. When I got through to a different operator, she already knew what was happening and had my address. She reassured me that the police were on their way. By this time, 20 minutes had passed. The man was still sitting in his car, but there was no sign of the police. For context, I live in a small town, so there shouldn't have been any delay. Just as the man started pulling out of my driveway, the police finally showed up, stopping him to ask a few questions. One of the officers then came to my door and handed me a strange flyer, saying it was just a landscaper who had an appointment. I felt a mix of relief and frustration, thinking it was just someone my mom had hired. But then, I realized something wasn't right. I called my mom and told her the cops said it was a landscaper who had an appointment. My mom immediately responded, saying, "I can assure you, we never hired a landscaper. We don't even need one." I had completely blocked this story from my mind until my girlfriend brought it up a couple of days ago. I started dating my girlfriend at the end of my senior year. Before we got together, I had been using multiple dating apps. On most of my profiles, I listed my Snapchat so people could add me. Nothing ever really came of it, just a few short conversations that would die out after a while. Once I started dating my girlfriend, I deleted the apps but never actually deactivated my account. So, my profile and Snapchat were still visible to anyone browsing the app. I didn't think much of it until a few people started adding me, and I would just tell them I had a girlfriend, and the conversation would end. But one guy, let's call him Adam, added me and asked if I was available. Since I'm straight, I was used to getting messages from guys, so I gave him the usual response, "Sorry, I have a girlfriend." I expected him to leave it at that, but he didn't. At first, the messages were just small talk, like asking how my day was or what I had been up to. I responded because I thought he just wanted to be friends. But then, the questions started to get creepy. He began asking about my girlfriend, but not the usual questions. Things like, "Is she good in bed?" I told him those were personal questions and that I wasn't comfortable answering them. Adam would apologize and disappear for a few days, but then he'd message me again with more creepy questions. Eventually, I told my girlfriend about it. She's super sweet, but also very protective of me. So she added him and basically told him to leave me alone. That didn't sit well with Adam. He responded by saying that I needed to get rid of my girlfriend. I defended my girlfriend, blocked Adam, and that was the end of it, at least for a while. About a week later, another guy added me. His name was Tyler, and he seemed nice. He respected my relationship with my girlfriend, and we talked casually. But over time, I began to notice that Tyler's vocabulary was very similar to Adam's. I didn't want to assume, so I didn't make any conclusions right away. I gave Tyler's Snapchat to my girlfriend, who added him to investigate. As soon as she added him, Tyler flipped out on her, confirming it was Adam. We blocked him again. Everything was quiet for about a month after that. My girlfriend and I both live down the street from each other in the suburbs of Chicago, and our families are close. We'd often house sit or pet sit for one another. About a month later, I received a letter in the mail with no return address, just my name on the front. I opened it, and to my shock and horror, it was a love letter from Adam. The letter started off saying how much he loved me and wanted me to run off with him. But then, it took a disturbing turn, with him describing in graphic detail what he wanted me to do to him and what he wanted to do to me. In that moment, two terrifying realizations hit me. One, he knew where I lived, and two, he had dropped the letter off in person, meaning he was in my town. I immediately called my girlfriend, who was just as shocked as I was, and after consulting with my parents, we called the police. Unfortunately, since I had blocked Adam on social media and the letter had no return address, there wasn't much the police could do. Days went by and letters kept showing up in my mailbox, and soon they started appearing in my girlfriend's mailbox as well. Her letters were much worse than mine. Adam wrote about how much he hated her and how much he wanted to hurt her. He also described in detail how he would inflict pain on her until she broke up with me. Like me, she took the letters to the police, but again, they couldn't do anything. My girlfriend's family had planned a vacation to Hawaii, and I was house-sitting for them. The first few days were fine, but on one of the last nights I was there, something unsettling happened. I was sitting on the couch watching TV when the power went out. It was around 1 a.m., and the house was pitch black when the lights suddenly shut off. The next few seconds were filled with silence, until I heard the sound of a window smashing from the office. To give you some context, let me describe the layout of the house. When you entered the front door, to your left was the living room, straight ahead were both the kitchen and stairs, and to the right was the office and dining room. Upstairs, once you reached the top of the stairs, there was a bathroom straight ahead, my girlfriend's room to the right, and the other bedrooms on the left. Immediately, I jumped up, grabbed a kitchen knife, and ran upstairs to find somewhere to hide while I called the cops. I rushed into my girlfriend's room and slipped into her closet. As soon as I was able to get in touch with the operator, I heard the sound of pounding footsteps as the intruder ran up the stairs. Thankfully, I managed to provide all the necessary details to the operator, who stayed on the line while we both stayed silent. The intruder took a left at the top of the stairs, buying me a few more precious minutes while I waited for the cops to arrive and prepared myself in case I needed to defend myself. A few minutes later, I heard the intruder start walking toward my girlfriend's room. With only a few seconds to spare, I slipped out of the closet and positioned myself next to the door. As soon as he opened it and began entering the room, I lunged at him, driving the kitchen knife into his shoulder. A young man screamed in pain, and I heard a heavy metallic object hit the ground with a loud thud. Without thinking, I bolted out of the house and was met by 4 squad cars parked outside. I threw my hands up, shouting that he was upstairs. A few minutes later, the intruder was dragged out of the house, still screaming in pain. With the flashing sirens lighting up the street, I got a brief glimpse of his face. It was Adam. Adam, who was from Texas, had traveled all the way to my state to find me. He had rented a room at a local motel and had been slipping letters into both my girlfriend's and my mailbox every day. He did this in the early hours of the morning, which was confirmed by security footage from the motel. That night, Adam had planned to hurt my girlfriend, or worse, along with her family. He had managed to pry open the power box and shut off the power to her house and several neighboring ones. He broke in, thinking my girlfriend would be there. Fortunately for her, she was away on a tropical vacation. Honestly, I can't imagine how things would have gone if I hadn't been there that night, and I'm incredibly thankful that my girlfriend and her family are safe. I'm also grateful every day that I was at that house instead of my girlfriend that night. This happened on Halloween of 2019. My friends and I were feeling the spooky vibes of the season and wanted to do something exciting to satisfy our thirst for a thrill. Being the reckless college kids we were, we decided to explore a place that was allegedly haunted, hoping to witness some real paranormal activity. Since we were from Illinois, the first place that came to mind was Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, a popular destination known for its eerie reputation. It was settled this was where we were going. Once the sun had set, we planned to make our move, sneaking into the cemetery after hours to get the full experience without worrying about other visitors. I'll admit, I'd always wanted to do something like this, but I was honestly terrified about what might be waiting for us in that cemetery so late at night. There were plenty of stories circulating about ghostly apparitions people had encountered, strange sounds that sent chills down their spines, and all sorts of spooky happenings. These thoughts were swirling in my mind long before we even started driving to the cemetery that evening. The drive was long but pleasant, though I couldn't stop thinking about the horrors that might be roaming the cemetery for all eternity, or so the rumors went. To make matters worse, we were trespassing just to get in. My nerves were a mess, but my friends, on the other hand, seemed totally unfazed. For the sake of this story, I'll call them Logan, Eddie, and Paul. The entire car ride, they were joking and laughing, not showing any sign of concern about what we were getting into or what we might encounter. Looking back now, I should have known their carefree attitude was a bad omen. There was no way we would be able to explore a place like this without them feeling some kind of nervousness, but what's done is done. By a little past 7, when the darkness had fully settled in, we arrived. Parking in the main lot was out of the question. We'd done some research and found out that local law enforcement had a habit of waiting there to catch explorers before they even set foot inside. So we had a backup plan. Since the cemetery was surrounded by a dense forest, creating a kind of square with roads going around it, we decided to park at a restaurant that stayed open late and had a large parking lot. We parked in the farthest spot from the restaurant, closer to the road, which was in the opposite direction of the cemetery's main entrance. We figured this would be our best chance to avoid the police and get in undetected. From there, we would cross the street on foot and take a somewhat hidden path that led into the forest. It would take longer to get to the cemetery this way since the trees were thick and dense, but it seemed worth it compared to the alternative. After everything was said and done, we found ourselves beginning our trek onto the path, unsure of how far we had actually have to go before we would find what we were looking for. It was a windy night, and even though it wasn't especially cold or anything, I still remember my teeth chattering and my skin going cold. Aside from the occasional sound of leaves being crunched under our shoes as we walked, there was absolute silence. My once cheerful and energetic friends were now, all of a sudden, quiet and subdued. Logan, in particular, had this odd expression on his face, it being illuminated by my phone's flashlight as we walked. It was some sort of cross between fear and pain, like every step he took was causing him physical harm. Before I could question him about it, we found ourselves at our destination. Here we were in the heart of Bachelor's Grove with graves all around us and a certain chill in the air. Everyone split up to cover more ground, promising to call the others over if they were to encounter something. I didn't want us to go too far away from one another, but I also didn't want to seem like a wuss, so I kept my mouth shut and began exploring. Most of the graves I looked at had withered away from time and the elements, so I couldn't really make out anything that was on the tombstones. The few dates that I could read went back to the late 1800s, and a sinking feeling in my stomach started once I realized these people had been dead and decaying in the ground for over 100 years now. Feeling extremely uncomfortable with this realization, I began to back away from the graves and started to look for my friends to see if they had found anything supernatural yet. When all of a sudden I heard it. Not just me either, all of us did. It was low, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. But with the way our senses were heightened, there was no way we would miss it. It appeared to be some sort of chanting, and it sounded like it was coming a little bit north from our direction, further into the clearing. I couldn't make out any of the words being spoken or if it was even English, but there was something creepy about the tone, like it was religious and the chanting was some sort of prayer. The voice that was doing the chanting was deep and gravely, belonging to some man that we couldn't see. The four of us shined our lights on each other to see our expressions. And at that moment, we knew what we were going to do. Despite every fiber in my being telling me not to go any further and see what the source of this chanting was, my curiosity got the better of me and I could not resist. Eddie whispered to us to turn our lights off completely while he dimmed his just enough to where it wouldn't attract too much attention, but we would still be able to see with it. The next few moments we spent creeping towards the noise, the more and more I started to lose it. My breathing was uncontrollable and it felt like my heart was beating 1,000,000 miles an hour. I was so afraid of what we would find, and yet I still had to know. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, We had entered the clearing and were a mere few steps away from the chanting. Eddie shined his light in the direction ahead of us, and for just a brief moment, we saw a cloaked figure bent over something in the grass, still chanting in that unrecognizable language. The thing in the grass looked like some sort of circle with a mark in the center, and I swear, I wish I could tell you I'm lying about this. But when I realized what the symbol was, I felt like throwing up. There was no mistake. It was a pentagram made of some strange material. For the moment that Eddie had illuminated the side in front of us, I had been able to get a glimpse of the pentagram's material being bright red, and I shouldn't have to say any more about that. Once the light from Eddie's phone hit the back of the man's head, he immediately stopped chanting and stood up, still facing the direction of the pentagram. I can only describe the next few minutes as truly unadulterated terror, because before we knew it, he screamed a blood-curdling scream that rattled us to the core and turned around, beginning to sprint towards us. Everything happened so fast. I couldn't even make out the man's facial features except for deep sunken eyes and an expression that radiated pure hatred. He really did want to bring us harm. Not wasting any time, we all fled the direction we came from and ran faster than I think any of us had ever ran in our entire lives. I couldn't even scream while running away. I was too petrified to make any noise. Maybe it was a miracle, but we somehow managed to retrace our steps all the way through the path we took to enter the cemetery and forest, and eventually came out to the main road, which was devoid of any traffic for the time being. Afraid of what I would see if I looked back, I made a beeline to the car along with the others and hopped into the back seat, not wasting any time to lock the door and roll up the window. We peeled out of there in no time flat and did not stop driving 20 over the speed limit until we were at least 10 minutes away. I honestly have no idea how far or for how long that man chased us, but I do know this for sure: we were not supposed to be there that night, and we must have been interrupting something important. I'll never know what it was, and honestly, I hope I never find out. We never did talk about this experience again after that night, and we never went on another trip to somewhere abandoned or haunted ever again either. I think that fright we felt is enough to satisfy us for the rest of our lives, and I'm thankful beyond words that we all managed to get out together alive. This event took place in Myanmar in 2005 when I was in my early teens. My family had just returned from a vacation in eastern Myanmar, and we were on our way back home. At that time, there were no modern motorways like we have now, so the highway we traveled on was built through villages and farms, and you could stop anywhere. The people involved in the incident were me, my parents, my aunts, my cousin, my older sister, and our driver. We were driving home on this old highway overnight, and around 3 a.m., our driver suddenly became unusually sleepy. This was strange because he had slept during the day and had been used to driving at night throughout the trip. So my father took over driving, but he became sleepy within minutes as well. I was awake while everyone else was asleep because I urgently needed to use the bathroom, so I was aware of what was happening. My dad decided to stop the car at a shelter called Zayat in Burmese. These shelters were common in villages and served different purposes. Inside, there were 2 large benches big enough to lie down on. Although I can't recall the exact location, it was somewhere remote near Naypyidaw, which is now the capital but hadn't been developed at that time. The driver went outside to rest on one of the benches, and I followed him outside. My sister and dad also came along. There were no lights except for our flashlights, and no other cars were on the road, so we couldn't see much around us. Dad, my sister, and I lay down on the other bench, and suddenly, out of nowhere, we all fell asleep, despite not even having finished our business. My sister and I woke up soon after, thinking someone had woken us up. I checked my watch. It was 3:30 a.m. We hadn't been asleep for long. Everyone else was still asleep, so I woke them up because I felt something wasn't right. We quickly got back into the car, locked the doors, and fell asleep again. That's when I had a nightmare that felt incredibly real. I dreamt of a creature from Burmese mythology called Belu, a shape-shifting monster, knocking on my window, trying to get inside. The creature laughed creepily and kept knocking, trying to get in, and it felt like hours. I woke up screaming, and the other 3 who had gone outside the car also woke up, terrified. I checked my watch again. It was now 5 a.m. It was light enough to finally see where we were. The place was filled with ruins of pagodas and an old cemetery. My dad and the driver quickly got back into the car, and we drove away immediately. My mom asked what had happened, and I told her about my dream. My sister then said, "Oh God, you too?" She had the same kind of dream, but in hers, she saw people carrying dead bodies. When she asked where she was, they told her it was the village of death and laughed creepily at her, trying to get her too, but she managed to run away. My dad and the driver had similar dreams involving the village of death, though with different monsters and ghosts. We later realized that the shelter where we had stopped was a place where funerals or prayers were held for the dead before they were buried or cremated. After driving for a while, we passed a recent car crash site with broken landmarks and flowers, which only added to the unease. What was even stranger was that my mom, cousin, and aunt didn't have any dreams at all. It was only the people who went outside that experienced these disturbing dreams, and they felt connected, incredibly real and frightening. The excessive sleepiness was odd too. None of us had been particularly tired, so how could we all fall asleep so quickly? Although we convinced ourselves they were just dreams, the entire area, the dreams, and everything about it left us with a deep sense of unease. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. The usual melody of birdsong that normally greeted me in the wilderness was eerily absent. As I unzipped my tent and peered out into the misty dawn, a sense of unease began to settle in. Something was off. Something was wrong. I'd come to these woods to find peace. After months of relentless work and a messy breakup, I needed time alone to clear my head. Solo camping had seemed like the perfect escape. But now, on the third morning in the backcountry, I was beginning to doubt my decision. I crawled out of my tent, stretched, and took a slow look around my campsite. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the soft earth surrounding my tent. My breath caught in my throat. These weren't from my boots, and they definitely weren't made by any animal I knew. They were bare human footprints, and they circled my tent several times. My heart pounded as I traced the tracks with my eyes. They led to my backpack, which I had left leaning against a tree the night before. But now it was unzipped, its contents slightly disordered. I rushed over to it, my hands trembling as I sifted through my things. Nothing appeared to be missing, but everything had been moved, just enough to be noticeable. I spun around, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, any trace of who had invaded my camp during the night. But the forest was still, the mist hanging low and muffling any sound that could betray an intruder's presence. Trying to steady my breath, I took a deep inhale and forced myself to think clearly. Maybe it was just another hiker who had unknowingly stumbled into my camp in the dark. Maybe they were lost searching for supplies. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. No lost hiker would circle a tent multiple times or rummage through someone's belongings so carefully without waking them. I needed to get out of there. I began packing my gear as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder, flinching at every crackling twig or rustling leaf. While rolling up my sleeping bag, something caught my eye. A small, intricately carved wooden figure lay on the ground just inside my tent. I knew for certain it hadn't been there when I went to sleep. With shaking fingers, I picked it up. It was roughly carved, but unmistakably shaped to represent a human figure. Notches had been carved where the eyes should be, giving it an unsettling, hollow gaze. As I turned it over in my hands, I felt something sticky. Looking closer, I realized with horror that the base of the figure was coated in a dark cyan reddish-brown substance. Blood. I dropped the figure as if it had burned me and scrambled backward. My heart pounding so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. This was no lost hiker. This was something much, much worse. Abandoning any pretense of stealth, I shoved the rest of my gear haphazardly into my backpack. I needed to get back to civilization, back to safety. I slung the pack over my shoulders and set off at a brisk pace, trying to remember the route I had taken to get here. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, which had seemed welcoming and peaceful just days ago, now loomed menacingly. Every shadow held a potential threat, every sound a possible pursuer. I found myself constantly looking back over my shoulder, sure that at any moment I would see someone or something following me. After what felt like hours of walking, I realized with growing panic that nothing looked familiar. The landmarks I had carefully noted on my way in were nowhere to be seen. Had I taken a wrong turn? Or had the forest itself somehow changed, rearranging itself to confuse and trap me? I stopped to check my map and compass, hoping to reorient myself. But as I pulled them out of my pack, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. The map had been altered. Crude drawings had been added in what looked like charcoal, stick figures scattered across the paper, all with the same hollow eyes as the wooden figure from my tent. And there, right where I estimated my current position to be, was a larger figure. Waiting, I dropped the map, my hands shaking uncontrollably now. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some sort of sick joke or a stress-induced hallucination. But the footprints, the wooden figure, the altered map, it was all too real, too tangible to be a figment of my imagination. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I whirled around, my heart in my throat. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape, just for a second, before it disappeared behind a large oak. Without thinking, I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and whatever was back there as possible. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but terror drove me onward. As I ran, I became aware of sounds behind me. Footsteps, keeping pace, but never quite catching up. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from my left, sometimes my right. Occasionally, I could have sworn they were right beside me, though I saw nothing when I dared to glance to the side. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. Its windows were dark, the door hanging crookedly on rusty hinges. Every instinct told me to keep running, to not trust this sudden appearance of shelter. But I was exhausted, and the footsteps behind me were getting closer. I made a split-second decision and sprinted for the cabin. I hit the door with my shoulder, wincing at the pain but grateful when it swung open. I slammed it shut behind me and frantically looked around for something to barricade it with. An old, heavy table stood against one wall. With strength born of desperation, I dragged it in front of the door. Only then did I allow myself to stop and catch my breath. The cabin was dark, dust motes dancing in the few beams of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. It smelled of mold and decay, and as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw that the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scraps of paper, and more of those unsettling wooden figures. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room, looking for another way out. There had to be a back door or a window I could climb through if I needed to. But as I turned to explore further, my foot caught on something and I stumbled. Looking down, I saw a trap door in the floor, half hidden under a ratty old rug. My curiosity warred with my fear. What was down there? A cellar where I could hide or something worse? Before I could decide whether or not to open it, I heard it. Footsteps on the porch outside, slow, deliberate, coming closer with each passing second. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall, praying that the barricade would hold. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. Soft laughter, followed by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I've been waiting for you," it said, the words slithering through the cracks in the walls. "We have so much to talk about." The door began to tremble, and the table scraped across the floor as something pressed against it from the outside. Panic surged through me as I searched desperately for a weapon, for a way out, anything. My eyes landed on the trapdoor. With no other options, I dashed toward it and wrenched it open. A dark, endless hole stared back at me, the bottom swallowed by shadows. The pressure on the door was growing stronger. The wood started to crack, I took a deep breath, whispered a silent prayer, and leapt into the void. I fell, feeling as though I was plummeting forever, the air rushing past, my stomach twisting. Then suddenly a jarring impact, but not the hard ground I had expected. Instead, I landed on something soft, something yielding. Disoriented, I blinked my eyes open. I was in my tent. Sunlight streamed through the fabric, and the familiar sound of birdsong filled the air. I sat up, my heart racing, scanning the surroundings. Everything was just as I had left it the night before. No footprints, no wooden figures, no signs of anything strange. Had it all been a dream? A vivid nightmare triggered by stress and isolation? I wanted to believe that, but as I reached to unzip the tent, my hand brushed against something small and hard. There, half buried in my sleeping bag, was a tiny wooden figure. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow me, and I could have sworn I heard faint laughter, carried on the breeze that stirred the trees. Within minutes, I was packed and on the trail, heading back to civilization as quickly as I could. I still didn't know what had happened, what was real, and what wasn't. But one thing was certain. I was never going camping alone again. Alright, bear with me here as I tend to ramble a bit when I tell stories. For some context, I've changed the names for privacy. My husband, Michael, and I are both in our 30s and have 2 toddlers. The couple I'll be talking about, let's call them Liz and her husband, Klinger. Now let's jump into the story. I was scrolling through Facebook one day when I came across a post in one of our local community groups. Liz had posted saying that she was new to the area and was looking to know where people hang out and make some friends. Naturally, being the outgoing person I am, I commented and said, "I'll be your friend." Looking back, I know it was a dumb move on my part, but I let my overly trusting and friendly nature get the best of me. Liz and I started chatting on Facebook, and it didn't take long for us to realize we had a lot in common. We even discovered that Klinger and I had mutual friends, which made me feel more comfortable meeting up. I arranged for the 4 of us to grab dinner and hang out. We had a good time, shared the same sense of humor, and it became a weekly thing. Liz and I would hang out and Klinger would invite Mike to play pool. But Mike's job was really demanding, and it left him little time to hang out. When he did have free time, he was usually too tired. That's when things with Klinger started getting weird. He kept asking Mike to come to pool night, but Mike had to decline because of work. Klinger completely lost it. He started texting Mike, calling him a part-time friend, and saying he couldn't handle having a friend who wasn't putting in enough effort. Klinger said Mike was leading him on as a friend, and we were both like, "What is going on with this guy?" Mike tried to explain that he had work and family obligations, and he didn't have to be Klinger's best friend. He told him to just relax. Mike stopped responding to Klinger's messages, and we tried to move on with our lives. Liz and I continued hanging out, just the 2 of us, figuring that Mike and Klinger didn't need to be involved. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Klinger then started messaging me, asking why Mike wouldn't want to hang out with him. He said Mike wasn't being nice. I tried to explain again that Mike was busy, but that just made Klinger even angrier. He started accusing Mike of not making enough time for me time and insisted that Mike should have a guy's night every week. I told Klinger that Mike and he didn't have to be friends if that wasn't working for him, but Klinger just wouldn't drop it. At this point, I probably should have cut ties with Liz and Klinger for good, but I convinced myself that I could still be friends with Liz alone. I then started to notice that Liz was becoming too clingy and would get mad if I said I felt like just hanging out at home instead of with her. She made me feel guilty for wanting to have time alone. So my idiot self fell for it and thought that it would be wrong of me to leave her to be lonely as she didn't have any other friends in the area. This, in turn, made me spend more money than we could afford as she always wanted to get drinks or food. Mike and I started arguing because Liz would twist things I said to her. Then Klinger would spit them out to Mike. I thought about ending our friendship, but wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. This all changed when I got a text from Liz asking if Mike and I would want to come over and do Molly with them. I am not into that stuff except for smoking occasionally, so I definitely wasn't about to go over to their place to do Molly. I I said that we couldn't, and I'm not into it anyway. Plus, we didn't have a sitter. Liz had the audacity to say that I should bring our kids over with us and their kids could play with them. I told her absolutely not, and she got mad that I said it was a bad idea. Meanwhile, Klinger is non-stop texting Mike saying that he's a piece of crap alcoholic, and that he doesn't give me enough time. Mike and I were totally taken aback as this came out of nowhere. And I never complained about my sex life to Liz or Klinger. In fact, I told Liz that I was content with it. I did mention Mike drinking a lot at the time, but didn't go into further detail, and it wasn't some big secret. Klinger then lectured Mike about him needing to quit drinking and that he's a piece of crap father just like his dad. My husband has his share of issues. Sure, but he's not a piece of crap dad, and he has dramatically improved since this occurred. Klinger then said that our kids are annoying and ugly. He told Mike that our son shouldn't have a pacifier and how we are intentionally screwing up his teeth. Keep in mind that they were around 16, 17 months and 3 years old with standard tantrums. Mike said that he was done with the conversation and that there was no reason for him to disrespect our family, which obviously included a few choice words. Mike said that he doesn't care what his sexual preference is, but it seems like Klinger seems to be looking for a boyfriend, not a friend. Klinger lost it and threatened Mike and said that he would break him in half. Mike blocked him on everything. Then I texted Liz saying that our friendship was overdue to her psycho husband. After we blocked them, we didn't hear from them again, but I was nervous for a good month that Klinger would show up at our house and try to do something. It didn't help knowing that Klinger regularly went on the dark web and hearing all the horror stories surrounding that. Also, at the time, they lived about 10 minutes away. Thankfully, I knew beforehand that they would be moving to a city about 40 minutes away in the near future, so I knew it would be unlikely that I would run into them. So long story short, I learned the hard way that when it comes to friends, it's quality, not the quantity of friendships. We have a couple of good friends now and are more than happy with that. For a few years, Omegle and chat roulette were the absolute best. I know it might sound silly, but the idea of meeting random people on the internet used to terrify me at first. I wasn't the most confident person when I was younger, and believe it or not, platforms like Omegle helped me break out of my shell and learn how to talk to strangers. And like anyone who's spent a lot of time on Omegle, I've got a ton of weird and strange encounters to share. Some of them were great. I met one of my longtime gaming buddies on there, and there were plenty of girls to chat with. But there were also the gross, sad, annoying, and downright terrifying experiences. And what I'm about to tell you is by far the most disturbing thing that ever happened to me on Omegle. And no, it's not some creepypasta. It's the truth. So, in 2012, I'd just gotten home from this awful part-time job I was working. My routine back then was pretty much the same. I'd get home, sneak a beer from my stepdad's stash in the garage, and then hop on Omegle to see what kind of weirdness I'd run into that day. For a while, things were going pretty well. I had a guy singing call me maybe, another dude who showed me a magic trick, a few cute girls, and even one guy who looked like he was on something. By the time I clicked end for what turned out to be my last chat of the night, I was in a pretty good mood. But when I clicked to start another chat, that's when things got weird. The screen popped up with a guy sitting at a desk, just staring blankly into the webcam. Immediately, I thought this was unusual because most people are looking at their screen to see who you are, not just staring into the camera. I said something like, "Hey, what's up?" But he didn't respond. At first, I thought maybe there was an issue with his audio. I should add that, around this time, I'd usually just skip someone if they seemed off or not interesting enough. With the weird stuff you see on Omegle, I ended up doing a lot of skipping. But something about this guy stood out to me. He looked like he could be in his early teens. Dark hair, dark eyes, a baby face with scrawny shoulders. But the longer I looked, the older he appeared. He had crow's feet and deep bags under his eyes, and I swear there were streaks of gray at his temples. If he was as young as I thought, he must have had the most brutal paper route ever. So, for some reason, at a time when I usually would have skipped him, I asked, "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" He nodded. He could hear me. That's when I thought maybe he was just high or something. I know it sounds a bit mean, but I figured I could mess with him a little and see if I could guess what he was on. So, I started talking real slow, trying to make him think time was slowing down or something, but he barely reacted. That's when I noticed something really strange. He hadn't once looked at his screen. The whole time, he was just staring at the lens of his webcam. I break from the play acting and just ask him straight up, "What are you on, man?" He shakes his head. So I ask him if he means he isn't on anything at all. And to that, he nods. Now I'm torn between laughing because of what could have been a blatant lie and kind of freaking out because if he wasn't lying, and that was him sober, that made for one really creepy guy. Then out of nowhere, this guy reaches up towards his mouth like he's about to take out some gum or something. At first, I think he's going to show me some weird root he's been chewing on that made him look all sleepy. I mean, if there is such a thing. I know people can get some pretty weird South American plants and stuff from shady websites, but then it becomes obvious that he has a hold of his tooth. His front tooth, I think, like in the grip of his thumb and forefinger. And then he starts to pull. I'm like, "Dude, what are you doing?" All calm at first. And then he starts like really getting a grip on his tooth, pulling and twisting. And I'm like, "Dude, stop. What are you doing?" This all escalates until I hear a deep cracking sound coming from the guy's mic. He twists the tooth free from his gum as blood starts pouring out of his mouth, then holds it up to the camera like he's all proud of himself. I am full on squealing at the computer at this point, stuck between wanting to cover my eyes and turn it off at the stack and not being able to look away because what is this guy even doing? I asked this guy in like 100 different ways. "Why did you do that? Was it rotten? Can't you go to the dentist? What are you doing?" He doesn't say a word. He just spends a few more seconds smiling this gaped tooth grin, mopping at the blood on his chin and holding up the tooth in front of the webcam. Then he disappears and I'm left on the new chat screen, just shell-shocked. Nothing has ever topped that for me in terms of pure creepiness. I have so many unanswered questions about that guy, and each time I think I get close to figuring it out, it just opens me up to 100 other questions. I mean, he would have been on something to be able to pull his own tooth out like that. I don't think anyone could stand the sheer agony of it sober. And it's also the whole idea that it wasn't his first time doing it. Like as crazy as it sounds, he seemed to just know what he was doing. That he had to twist it and wrench it. He knew exactly how to grip it. And then the sense of pride at the end. It all just gave me this distinct feeling that he had done that kind of thing before. I didn't see anything else that ever made me react so strongly. And after that, all the random stuff you would see didn't faze me at all. Like as long as there was no tooth pulling, it was just water off a duck's back. So I guess I have something to thank Mr. Tooth Puller for. Although saying that, it's not something I want to see ever again.